The afternoon sun hammered down on the Pentagon parking lot like judgment itself. Colonel James MacArthur stood beside his Ford F-150, the truck's blue paint faded by 15 years of loyal service, and stared at the building where he just received his final orders. 59 years old, 35 years in uniform, 6 months until retirement. The numbers felt like prison bars closing in. His reflection caught in the truck's side mirror. Silver hair cropped military short, a scar tracing his left cheekbone from Fallujah, back when the world made sense. Lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too much and forgot nothing. The uniform still fit perfectly across his shoulders, but something inside it felt hollow now, like a house after the family moves out. The leather folder in his hand contained everything. Orders to Fort Carson, Colorado, temporary command. 6 months to fix what 3 years of rotating leadership had broken. General William Garrett's handwriting on the margin. "Mac, I need you to do this. Please." Please. When was the last time a 4-star general said please to anyone? MacArthur climbed into the truck and pulled the door shut. The interior still smelled faintly of his son. David had borrowed it 3 years ago, drove it for 2 weeks before deploying to Afghanistan. Never came back to return it. The air freshener David had hung from the mirror, some ridiculous pine tree shape, still dangled there. MacArthur had never been able to take it down. He started the engine. The V8 rumbled to life, familiar and reassuring. He'd driven this truck through rainstorms and snowdrifts, had hauled furniture when David went to college, had sat in it outside the hospital the night his wife died. Some men measured their lives in promotions and medals. MacArthur measured his in miles driven and promises kept. The drive from Virginia to Colorado would take 2 days if he pushed it, but MacArthur wasn't in a hurry. Retirement waited at the end of this road like an empty room. 6 more months of purpose, then what? Fishing, golf, sitting in a recliner watching cable news and yelling at the television. The thought tasted like ash. He thought about Garrett's words that morning. They'd stood in the general's office, 2 old war dogs too stubborn to admit they were tired. Fort Carson's dying, Mac. The discipline's gone, the spirit's gone. Hell, last inspection they found moldy MREs from 2019 still in the supply room. Nobody even noticed. Then send someone who cares about inspections. I'm sending someone who cares about soldiers. Garrett had fixed him with that 1,000-yard stare they'd both learned in the Gulf. Your boy died because some lieutenant didn't enforce weapons maintenance protocols. You think I forgot that? You think I don't know that's why you're running toward retirement instead of into it? The words had landed like artillery. David's death isn't why I'm retiring. Isn't it? Garrett moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. You've been the best officer I've ever served with, Mac. But for 3 years you've been going through the motions. Ever since Arlington. Ever since you stood at that grave and decided the only way to survive losing him was to stop feeling anything at all. MacArthur had wanted to argue, wanted to tell Garrett he was wrong, that he'd processed his grief, that he was fine. But lies don't work between men who have bled together. What do you want from me, Bill? 6 months. Take Fort Carson. Make it what it should be. Then retire knowing you prevented some other father from getting that phone call, from standing in some chaplain's office hearing that his son bled out in a ditch because the soldier next to him didn't know his job. Now driving west through Virginia hills turning gold with autumn, MacArthur replayed that conversation on an endless loop. Part of him wanted to turn around. Part of him wanted to drive straight past Colorado and keep going until the Pacific stopped him. But the largest part, the part that had survived 3 decades of service, knew Garrett was right. He pulled into a truck stop outside Knoxville as the sun bled red across the horizon. Inside, Fluorescent lights hummed over tired travelers hunched over coffee and pie. MacArthur ordered both, sat in a corner booth, and opened the folder. Fort Carson's file read like an autopsy report: declining readiness scores, failed inspections, morale surveys that would make a prison warden wince. The last 3 commanders had rotated through in 18 months, each one promising reform, each one transferring out before delivering. The current acting commander was a Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hastings. MacArthur studied the man's service photo. 45 years old, never deployed, risen through staff positions and political connections. The kind of officer who knew PowerPoint better than tactics. But it was the last page that made MacArthur's coffee taste like poison. Casualty reports, nothing combat-related, training accidents. A private who died from heat stroke during a road march nobody properly supervised. A specialist who'd fallen from a rappelling tower with faulty safety equipment. Not deaths that made the news. Just young men who'd trusted the system to keep them alive, and the system had failed. He closed the folder and stared at his reflection in the window. Somewhere in Kansas, his son's name was carved into black granite at Fort Leavenworth's memorial wall. Captain David MacArthur, killed in action because his support unit had failed to arrive on time. Failed because their commander hadn't drilled them properly. Failed because someone, somewhere up the chain, had decided discipline was optional. MacArthur left $20 on the table for a $12 meal and walked back to his truck. The night air smelled like diesel and rain. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, then reached up and touched the stupid pine tree air freshener. "All right, Davy," he said to the empty cab. "Let's go save some kids." The rest of the drive blurred past in a meditation of white lines and truck stops. MacArthur crossed into Colorado as dawn painted the Rockies purple and gold. He'd been here before, years ago, when Fort Carson had been a name that meant something. When drill sergeants took pride in their work, and soldiers believed in more than just collecting a paycheck. He stopped at a diner outside Colorado Springs for breakfast. The waitress was maybe 60, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dorothy. She poured coffee without asking and smiled like she meant it. "Just passing through, honey." "Going to work?" "Oh yeah, what kind of work brings folks out here?" MacArthur hesitated. "I fix broken things." Dorothy nodded like that made perfect sense. "Well, we got plenty of those. You need anything else, you holler." He ate scrambled eggs and hash browns while watching the sunrise through the window. A few tables over, a young couple fed pancakes to a toddler in a high chair. The kid kept laughing, that pure sound children make before life teaches them to be careful with joy. The father looked maybe 25, military haircut, wedding ring, tired eyes that suggested late nights and early mornings. He caught MacArthur watching and nodded. MacArthur nodded back. That young father had no idea how fragile it all was, how a phone call could shatter everything, how you could go to work one day and come home to a world where your son was past tense. He paid the bill and left another generous tip. Dorothy called out, "Good luck fixing things," as he walked out, and MacArthur wondered if she somehow knew he was trying to fix himself. Fort Carson appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Guard towers, barbed wire, buildings that had seen better decades. MacArthur pulled off the highway and onto the access road, his heart rate ticking up despite himself. This was it, the last mission. 6 months to prove that everything he'd believed in for 35 years still mattered. He'd called ahead to say he was coming, but deliberately gave no arrival time. Wanted to see the base as it really was, not as it pretended to be when inspectors showed up. So when he rolled up to the main gate at 2 in the afternoon, nobody was expecting Colonel James MacArthur. The gate itself told him everything he needed to know. The guard shack looked like it hadn't been painted since Reagan was president. The barrier arm hung at a drunken angle, and inside the climate-controlled booth, two soldiers in wrinkled uniforms sat staring at their phones like teenagers in detention. MacArthur stopped the truck at the white line and waited. Neither guard looked up. He waited another 30 seconds, still nothing. Finally, he tapped the horn, once, polite. The younger guard glanced up with the expression of someone deeply annoyed at being interrupted. He was maybe 19, with the soft face of someone who'd never been hungry or scared. His name tape read Reeves, but it was peeling at one corner. He slouched to the window and leaned out. "Yeah, what do you need, Pops?" MacArthur felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger. Anger was hot and temporary. This was the kind of cold that crept into your bones during a winter deployment and never quite left. "I need to enter the base." "You got a visitor pass. Appointment." The kid, Reeves, didn't even try to hide the boredom in his voice. Behind him, the other guard, older, maybe 30, watched with the detached interest of someone watching a rerun. "I have orders." MacArthur pulled the leather folder from the passenger seat and handed it through the window. Reeves took it like he was accepting a menu at a restaurant he didn't want to eat at. He flipped it open, scanned the first page with eyes that clearly weren't reading, and handed it back. "These are dated yesterday. We didn't get any notification about a Colonel MacArthur. Probably fake. You should come back tomorrow when admin's open, old man." The cold in MacArthur's chest spread. Old man. This child wearing his country's uniform, protected by the blood of better men, called him old man. "Son, those orders are legitimate. I'm your new commanding officer. Now step aside and raise that barrier." Reeves actually laughed. The sound bouncing off the guard shack's cheap paneling. "Dude, if you were a real colonel, we'd have gotten a call. Plus, colonels don't drive beat-up pickup trucks. Nice try, though. Points for creativity." The other guard finally spoke up. His name tape read Chen. "Just turn around, sir. Save yourself the hassle. Come back with proper authorization." MacArthur sat very still. Somewhere in his mind, a younger version of himself wanted to explode. Wanted to drag these two smirking children out of their air-conditioned comfort and teach them what the uniform meant. But he'd learned a long time ago that rage was a tool, and like any tool, it only worked when you used it precisely. "Private Reeves," he said, voice dropping to conversational quiet, "step back from the window." Something in his tone must have penetrated. Reeves's smirk faltered. MacArthur opened the truck door and stepped out. The heat hit him like a wall, 95 degrees and climbing. He walked past Reeves into the guard shack, picked up the phone on the desk and dialed the base operator. "This is Colonel James MacArthur. Connect me to Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, now." The operator, bless her, didn't question. Maybe she heard something in his voice. Maybe she just followed protocol. Either way, the line clicked twice and then a voice answered, irritation bleeding through the speaker. "This is Hastings. Who am I speaking with?" "Colonel MacArthur, your new commanding officer. I'm standing at the main gate where two of your soldiers just denied me entry to my own base. You have 5 minutes to get here. After that, I start making phone calls you won't enjoy." Silence on the other end. Then carefully, "Sir, I didn't receive notification of your arrival." "That's not my problem, Colonel. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. MacArthur hung up. Reeves and Chen stared at him like he'd just materialized from another dimension. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression neutral as stone. "Gentlemen, when that barrier goes up and I drive through, your lives are going to change. How they change depends entirely on how you conduct yourselves in the next few minutes. Do you understand?" Neither answered. That was answer enough. MacArthur walked back to his truck and leaned against the hood, arms crossed. The sun baked the asphalt. The mountains in the distance shimmered through heat waves. Inside the guard shack, he could see Reeves and Chen frantically whispering to each other, probably trying to figure out if this was real or some elaborate prank. 3 minutes later, a jeep came screaming up the access road from inside the base. It skidded to a stop and out stepped Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hastings, looking exactly like his photo but sweatier. He was in his physical training uniform, which meant MacArthur had interrupted his afternoon workout. Good. Hastings approached and threw a salute that would have made a drill sergeant weep. Sloppy, performative, the salute of a man who'd forgotten why it mattered. "Colonel MacArthur, sir, I apologize for the confusion. If I'd known you were arriving today, I would have arranged proper reception." MacArthur returned the salute with the precision of 3 decades' practice. "Get in your vehicle, Colonel. You're going to give me a tour." "Sir, I should probably change into my uniform first, and perhaps we could schedule a more formal orientation tomorrow, when the staff is prepared to brief you on current operations and—" "Get in your vehicle." Hastings got in his vehicle. MacArthur climbed into the passenger seat of the Jeep. The interior smelled like protein shake and ambition. Hastings drove through the now-raised barrier without looking at Reeves or Chen, though MacArthur made sure to lock eyes with both of them as they passed. He wanted them to see him, wanted them to understand that consequences were coming. "Sir, if I may," Hastings began as they drove deeper into the base, "I want to assure you that the incident at the gate was an isolated—" "Stop talking," MacArthur said quietly. "Drive." They drove. For 3 hours, MacArthur had Hastings take him to every corner of Fort Carson. The barracks looked like college dorms after a bad semester. Unmade beds, trash overflowing. One room actually had pizza boxes stacked against the wall like some kind of grease-stained art installation. The soldiers they encountered scrambled to attention when they saw officers, but the surprise on their faces suggested officer presence was rare. The arms room was worse. Weapons that hadn't been cleaned properly, missing serial numbers on the log sheets. MacArthur pulled an M4 from the rack at random and found dust in the barrel. Dust. In a weapon that could mean the difference between a soldier going home or going to Arlington. He said nothing, just put the rifle back and gestured for Hastings to continue. The motor pool was a graveyard of vehicles in various states of disrepair. The mess hall served food that looked like it had surrendered to entropy weeks ago. The training grounds showed evidence of exercises run without proper supervision. Brass casings littered ranges that should have been policed. Safety equipment hung in tangles. But the worst moment came at the company office where MacArthur asked to see the training records. The junior officer who pulled the files actually looked nervous, and MacArthur understood why the moment he opened the first binder. Falsified signatures, incomplete after-action reports, training exercises marked complete that clearly never happened. "Who signed off on these?" MacArthur asked, his finger on a particularly egregious example. The lieutenant swallowed hard. "Sir, that would be me, but—" "Get out." "Sir." "Get out of this office. I'll deal with you later." The lieutenant fled. MacArthur turned to Hastings, who'd gone very pale. "How long has this been going on?" "Sir, the training record issue is something I've been meaning to address, but with limited staff and operational tempo." "How long?" Hastings deflated. "Since before I arrived, probably 2 years." MacArthur closed the binder very carefully, the way you'd close a coffin. "Take me to see the senior NCO in charge of base security." "That would be Sergeant First Class Holloway, but sir, he has some issues. He was transferred here from—" I don't care about his history. Take me to him." They found Marcus Holloway in the security office, a cramped room with flickering fluorescent lights and maps of the base on the walls. He stood when they entered, came to attention, and delivered a salute that was the first correct thing MacArthur had seen all day. Sharp, respectful, the salute of a soldier who still remembered what it meant. Holloway was 33 but looked older. He had the build of someone who'd spent years carrying heavy loads over long distances. His eyes were careful, guarded. MacArthur recognized the look. He'd seen it in mirrors often enough. The look of someone who'd lost faith in the system but couldn't quite abandon it. MacArthur returned the salute and gestured for him to stand easy. "Sergeant Holloway, I'm Colonel MacArthur. New Co., tell me about yourself." "Not much to tell, sir. 12 years in service. Delta Force for 9 of them. Reassigned here 8 months ago." "Why were you reassigned?" Holloway's jaw tightened. "I struck a superior officer, sir." "Why?" "He was abusing a private under his command, verbally and psychologically. I asked him to stop. He refused. I made him stop." MacArthur studied the man for a long moment. Behind him, he could feel Hastings radiating disapproval. MacArthur ignored him. "Do you regret it, Sergeant?" "I regret the method, sir, not the outcome." "If you could do it again, what would you do differently?" "I'd report through proper channels, let the system handle it." A pause, "even though the system rarely does." MacArthur almost smiled. Almost. "Sergeant Holloway, effective immediately, you're my senior NCO. You'll assist me in rebuilding this base." Holloway blinked. "Sir, I'm not sure that's—" "I'm not asking. Dismissed. Report to my office at 0500 tomorrow, wherever my office turns out to be." "Yes, sir." After Holloway left, Hastings finally found his voice. "Sir, with all respect, Holloway is damaged goods. He has anger management issues. Putting him in a position of authority sends the wrong message." MacArthur turned to face Hastings fully for the first time. "Colonel, let me be very clear about something. I didn't come here to send messages. I came here to fix what's broken. Sometimes that means using tools other people threw away. Now show me where I'm sleeping tonight." The temporary quarters were exactly what MacArthur expected. Generic, sterile, a bed, a desk, a small bathroom. The kind of room designed for people who were just passing through and never meant to leave a mark. He dropped his bag on the bed and told Hastings to assemble all officers and senior NCOs for a meeting at 0600 the next morning. "Sir, that's very short notice. Some of our people don't come in until 0730 or later, and then they can start coming in earlier. 0600 dismissed." After Hastings left, MacArthur sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Sarah. "Call me when you get settled. Love you." He didn't call, couldn't, not yet. Instead, he opened his laptop and navigated to a folder he'd labeled simply David. Inside were photos, videos, documents, everything he had left of his son. He clicked on the after-action report from the mission that had killed him. He'd read it hundreds of times, knew every word, but he read it again anyway, like penance. Captain David MacArthur had died because his support unit failed to arrive at the designated time. They'd failed to arrive because their vehicles weren't properly maintained. The vehicles weren't maintained because their motor pool sergeant cut corners. The sergeant cut corners because his commanding officer didn't enforce standards. The commanding officer didn't enforce standards because somewhere up the chain, someone had decided that being liked was more important than being respected. David had bled out in Afghan dirt because of a broken link in a chain that should have been unbreakable. MacArthur closed the laptop and looked around the bare room. This was his penance. His last chance to make sure no other father got that phone call. No other mother folded a flag at a funeral for a son who died not from enemy fire but from negligence. He thought about the young soldiers he'd seen today. Reeves with his cocky smirk, the private who couldn't make his bed, the specialist who hadn't cleaned his weapon. They reminded him of David at that age, immortal, invincible, convinced that nothing could touch them. David had believed that right up until he didn't. MacArthur stood and walked to the window. The base spread out before him in the fading light. Somewhere out there, young men and women were preparing for a war they thought they understood. They had no idea that the real enemy wasn't waiting in some desert or jungle. It was right here. Complacency, laziness, the slow rot that set in when people stopped caring about excellence. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. "I know you're not calling because you're busy, but Mac, please talk to someone, anyone. You can't keep running from this." He turned off the phone. At 2200 hours, MacArthur left his quarters and walked across the dark base. The air had cooled to something almost pleasant. Lights burned in scattered windows. Somewhere, music thumped from a barracks. Someone laughed. Normal sounds. The sounds of people who didn't yet understand that normal was about to end. He made his way to the main gate. Reeves and Chen had been replaced by a night shift crew, but MacArthur could see the two of them in the guard shack office, filling out what looked like incident reports. Good. Maybe they were learning. He walked past without stopping and found a bench near the flagpole. Above him, the American flag hung limp in the still air. 50 stars, 13 stripes. How many men had died for that piece of cloth? How many mothers had wept? How many fathers had stood at graves and wondered if it was worth it? MacArthur had asked himself that question at David's funeral. Standing there in his dress blues, accepting condolences from generals and privates alike, holding a folded flag that was supposed to somehow compensate for the hole in his life. At the time, he hadn't known the answer. He still didn't. But he knew this. If David's death had to mean something, then no other soldier would die on his watch from preventable causes. Not from lazy leadership. Not from broken systems. Not from people who forgot that the uniform was a sacred trust. He sat on that bench until midnight, watching the base settle into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would be the first day of the last mission. 6 months to turn this collection of buildings and broken spirits into something that honored the men and women who died for it. 6 months to prove that the old ways, the hard ways, the ways that demanded excellence and accepted nothing less, still mattered. At midnight exactly, MacArthur stood and walked back to his quarters. He had 3 hours until he needed to wake up. 3 hours to rest before the war began. Not a war fought with bullets and bombs. A war fought with discipline and standards. A war against the easy path, the shortcut, the good enough. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the hollow ache of loss. He felt purpose, cold and hard and unforgiving, but purpose nonetheless. Somewhere in the darkness, his phone lit up with one final message. This time from General Garrett. "Give them hell, Mac. Make the old guard proud." MacArthur typed back a single word, "Roger." Then he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. Tomorrow, at 0500, Sergeant Holloway would report. At 0600, the officers would assemble. And by 0630, Fort Carson would understand that everything had changed. The last commandant had arrived. And he was done being patient. The alarm on MacArthur's phone screamed at 0430, but he was already awake. Had been awake since 0300, staring at the ceiling and running through the plan. Not the official plan, the one he'd present to the officers in 90 minutes. The real plan. The one that would either save Fort Carson or end his career in disgrace. He rose, showered in water that never quite got hot enough, and dressed in the darkness. The uniform felt different this morning, heavier, like putting on armor before battle. He checked his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Same face, same scars, but the eyes looked different, focused, alive in a way they hadn't been since the funeral. By 0450, he was walking across the base in pre-dawn darkness. The air tasted clean and cold, the kind of cold that reminded you that you were breathing, that you were still here while others weren't. His boots made the only sound on the empty sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. MacArthur wondered what fool had brought chickens onto a military base, then decided he had bigger problems. Sergeant First Class Marcus Holloway stood outside the building that housed the command offices, already at attention, already waiting. The man had probably been there since 0400, MacArthur guessed. Good. The military ran on people who showed up early and stayed late, people who understood that excellence lived in the margins. MacArthur stopped in front of him. "At ease, Sergeant, come inside." They walked into an office that smelled like old coffee and older disappointment. MacArthur flipped on the lights and gestured to a chair. Holloway remained standing. "Sit, Marcus. This isn't that kind of conversation." Holloway sat, but his posture stayed rigid, guard up, waiting for the other shoe to drop. MacArthur understood. When you've been burned by the system, you learn to expect heat. "I read your file last night," MacArthur began, settling into the chair behind the desk. "Delta Force, 3 tour, commendations for valor, then one punch and it all goes away." "Yes, sir." "The officer you hit, Captain Bradley. He was screaming at an 18-year-old private, called him worthless, called him a waste of oxygen, made him cry in front of his squad. That's what the report says." Holloway's jaw worked. "The report says a lot of things, sir." "It doesn't say that Captain Bradley had been doing this for months, that you'd reported him twice through proper channels and nothing happened, that the private, a kid named Morrison, tried to kill himself 3 days before you intervened. The report doesn't say any of that." Holloway looked up, surprise breaking through the careful mask. "How did you?" "I made some calls, talked to people who were there, people who wished they'd had your courage." MacArthur leaned forward. "You saved that kid's life, Marcus. Morrison's still in service, did you know that? Stationed in Germany now. Married. Got a daughter. He's alive because you were willing to sacrifice your career to protect him." "I should have found another way." "Maybe, but you found the way you could live with. That's more than most people manage." MacArthur pulled out a notebook, opened it to a blank page. "I'm going to ask you a question and I need you to be completely honest. Can you do that?" "I'll try, sir." "Do you still believe in what the uniform represents, or did they beat that out of you?" The silence stretched like wire. Somewhere outside, a vehicle engine coughed to life. Finally, Holloway spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe, sir. I want to believe that we're still the good guys. That discipline means something. That when we tell these kids we'll take care of them, we mean it." He met MacArthur's eyes. "But I've seen too much evidence to the contrary." "Then help me create new evidence. Help me prove that the system can still work if good people refuse to let it fail." MacArthur slid the notebook across the desk. "I need you to make a list. Everything that's broken, gate security, barracks, training, all of it. Don't hold back. Don't worry about feelings or politics. Just truth." Holloway picked up the pen. "And then what, sir?" "Then we fix it. One thing at a time. One soldier at a time. Until this base looks like a base again and not a summer camp for people who have given up." "Sir, with respect, I've heard this speech before. Every new commander says they're going to change things. Then they realize how hard it is and they stop trying." MacArthur stood and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, purple bleeding into gray. My son was killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago, Captain David MacArthur. He died because his support unit failed to arrive on time. They failed because their equipment wasn't maintained. Their equipment wasn't maintained because their leadership accepted mediocrity. I spent 3 years running from that truth, Sergeant. I'm done running. This is my last chance to make David's death mean something. So no, I won't stop trying. I can't. When he turned back, Holloway was staring at him with something that might have been understanding or might have been pity. MacArthur didn't care which. I'll have that list by 1700, sir. I know you will. Dismissed. At 0600 exactly, MacArthur walked into the conference room where Fort Carson's officers and senior NCOs had assembled. 60 men and women in various states of readiness. Some in perfect uniform. Others looked like they'd rolled out of bed 10 minutes ago. A few were actually late, stumbling in at 0605 and 0608, mumbling apologies that MacArthur ignored. He stood at the front of the room and said nothing, just watched them. Let the silence build until it became uncomfortable, then painful, then unbearable. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. MacArthur kept watching. Finally, when he judged the moment was right, he spoke. My name is Colonel James MacArthur. 6 months ago, I was planning my retirement. Then General Garrett called and told me this base was dying. He asked me to come save it. I said no. I was tired. I'd given enough. I just wanted to be done. He paused. Then he reminded me that my son died because someone somewhere decided that good enough was good enough. So I changed my mind. The room was absolutely still now, not the restless silence from before, something deeper, attention. I spent yesterday touring this base. I saw things that made me ashamed to wear this uniform. Soldiers who can't make their beds, weapons that aren't maintained, training records that are fiction. And you know what the worst part was? Nobody seemed to care. You've all decided that this is just how things are now. Standards are suggestions. Discipline is optional. Excellence is for other people. A major in the third row, a man whose name tag read Willis, raised his hand slightly. MacArthur nodded at him. Sir, if I may, the military has changed. Today's soldiers are different. They need motivation, not intimidation. They need to understand why they're doing something, not just be ordered to do it. The old methods don't work anymore. Stand up, Major. Willis stood, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. How long have you been in service? 12 years, sir. Combat deployments? 2, sir. Iraq and Afghanistan. Did the enemy care about your soldiers' motivation? Did they stop shooting because your people needed to understand why they were taking cover? No, sir, but... Then sit down and listen. MacArthur's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a blade. You're right that soldiers need to understand purpose. You're wrong that discipline and purpose are enemies. They're partners. You can't have one without the other. A soldier who understands why he's fighting but lacks the discipline to maintain his weapon is just a corpse waiting to happen. A soldier who has discipline but no purpose is a robot. We need both. Willis sat, his face red but his eyes thoughtful. MacArthur continued. Here's what's going to happen. Starting today, we rebuild this base from the foundation up. Daily inspections. Real ones, not the kind where we all pretend not to notice problems. Training exercises that mean something. Standards that are non-negotiable. And most importantly, accountability. When something goes wrong, we fix it. We don't hide it, ignore it, or hope it goes away. Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, sitting in the front row, cleared his throat. Sir, that's an admirable goal, but the reality is we're understaffed, overworked, and dealing with a culture that's been entrenched for years. Change takes time. We can't just flip a switch and... You're relieved of operational command, Colonel Hastings. You'll focus exclusively on administrative duties. Major Willis, you're now acting operations officer. Sergeant Holloway is my senior NCO for all matters relating to base security and discipline. Questions? The room erupted, not loudly. Military discipline held enough that nobody shouted, but the murmurs rose like a wave, confusion and anger mixing into something volatile. MacArthur let it build for exactly 10 seconds, then raised one hand. The room fell silent. I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to make sure that when these soldiers deploy, they come home. That means we do our jobs, all of us, starting now. He looked at each face in turn. Anyone who can't accept that, submit your transfer request by 1700 today. No hard feelings, but if you stay, you work. Understood? A chorus of "yes, sir" filled the room, some voices stronger than others. Good, Major Willis, Sergeant Holloway remain. Everyone else dismissed. As the room cleared, MacArthur caught sight of Hastings's face. The man looked like he'd been slapped, humiliated in front of his subordinates, stripped of authority. Part of MacArthur felt bad about that. The smaller part. The part that remembered being a young officer who'd made mistakes and needed grace. But the larger part, the part that had buried his son, felt nothing at all. Willis and Holloway approached the front. Willis still looked uncertain, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Holloway looked like a man who'd been offered water after years in the desert and was afraid to drink in case it was a mirage. Major, MacArthur began, I put you in charge of operations not because I think you're ready, but because you asked the right question. You challenged me. That tells me you're thinking. But now I need you to think differently. Can you do that? I can try, sir. Trying isn't good enough. You either can or you can't. Which is it? Willis straightened. I can, sir. Good. Sergeant Holloway has a list of everything that's broken. You're going to help me fix it, starting with the gate. Over the next 2 weeks, Fort Carson woke up, not gently, not with understanding nods and gradual improvement. It woke up the way you wake up when someone throws ice water in your face. Shock, anger, then, eventually, grudging acceptance. MacArthur was everywhere. He walked the base at 0500 every morning, appearing outside barracks like some kind of uniformed ghost. Soldiers stumbled out of their bunks to find him standing in their doorways, clipboard in hand, making notes. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, just wrote things down in his terrible handwriting and moved on. But the things he wrote down became action items. A barracks with overflowing trash cans found itself assigned to police the entire quadrant. A soldier with an improperly maintained weapon spent the next day teaching a class on weapons maintenance to his entire platoon. The punishment wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was logical consequence tied to the failure. Private Tommy Reeves learned this the hard way. After the gate incident, MacArthur had assigned him to what everyone assumed would be permanent latrine duty, career-ending humiliation. But instead, at 0500 on his third day at Fort Carson, MacArthur appeared outside Reeves's barracks. Get dressed, Private, you're with me. They walked in silence to the command building as the sun painted the mountains orange and gold. MacArthur led him to a small office, gestured to a chair, and pulled out a leather-bound journal from his desk drawer. This belonged to my son, Captain David MacArthur. He kept it from the day he entered basic training until 2 weeks before he died. Everything he learned he wrote down, every lesson, every failure, every victory, it's all in here. He held the journal out. Reeves stared at it like it might explode. Sir, I don't understand. You called me an old man, you laughed at your duty. You treated the uniform like a costume instead of a calling. I could punish you for that, send you to some dead-end assignment and forget you exist. But I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to teach you what you should have been taught from the beginning. Why this matters. Why discipline isn't punishment. Why excellence isn't optional. Sir, every morning at 0500 you report to me. We'll spend 2 hours before your regular duty day. I'm going to train you personally, not because you deserve it, because the Army deserves better than what you've been giving it. Take the journal, read it. Tomorrow we start. Reeves took the journal with trembling hands. Why, sir? Why would you waste your time on me? MacArthur looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what he always saw when he looked at young soldiers. David, the ghost of his son in every 19-year-old face. The potential for greatness or tragedy, separated by nothing more than whether someone cared enough to teach them. Because someone wasted time on me once, Private, and I'm still here because of it. The training began the next morning. MacArthur didn't start with push-ups or running. He started with a question. Why do you make your bed every morning? Reeves, standing at attention in the cold dawn, stammered out an answer. Because it's regulation, sir. Wrong. You make your bed because it teaches you that small things done well lead to big things done well. You make your bed because if you can't accomplish a simple task first thing in the morning, you'll accomplish nothing else all day. You make your bed because discipline is a muscle, and like any muscle, you have to exercise it or it atrophies. Day by day, lesson by lesson, MacArthur rebuilt Reeves from the ground up, not with shouting or insults, with patience, with explanation, with the kind of attention that said you matter, your growth matters, your potential matters. He showed him how to polish boots not just to pass inspection, but to develop the kind of attention to detail that would later help him spot an IED by the roadside. How to field strip a weapon until he could do it blindfolded, because in combat, you might have to do it in the dark with shaking hands and incoming fire. How to stand at attention not because some regulation demanded it, but because posture was the physical manifestation of pride. And every lesson connected back to David's journal. The young captain's handwriting filled those pages with observations that were now teaching a new generation. It was as if David was still here, still serving, still making a difference. Reeves changed, not overnight, not dramatically, but like water shaping stone, steady and inexorable. He started showing up at 0430 instead of 0500, started asking questions instead of just following orders, started helping other soldiers in his barracks who were struggling. Holloway noticed. He pulled MacArthur aside one morning after watching Reeves lead a squad through equipment checks. Sir, that kid, Reeves, 3 weeks ago he was the worst soldier I'd ever seen. Now he's teaching others. How did you do that? MacArthur watched Reeves demonstrating the proper way to inspect a gas mask to a group of attentive privates. I didn't do anything, Sergeant. I just gave him a reason to care. Everything else followed from that. We need to do this with more of them, all of them. That's the plan. But not everyone was changing for the better. Lieutenant Colonel Hastings had retreated into sullen compliance, doing the administrative work assigned to him but radiating resentment. MacArthur caught him in the break room one afternoon, staring at his coffee like it held answers. Colonel, got a minute? Hastings looked up, his face carefully neutral. Of course, sir. They sat at a small table scarred with coffee rings and years of wear. MacArthur waited for Hastings to speak first, an old interrogation trick. Silence made people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people talked. You humiliated me, sir, in front of my subordinates, my peers. I did. May I ask why? Because you were wrong, and I needed everyone to see that wrong has consequences. MacArthur took a sip of coffee that had gone cold. But I also need you to understand something. I don't think you're a bad officer. I think you're an officer who adapted to a bad system. You learned to survive by going along, by not making waves, by accepting good enough because demanding excellence would have made you the problem. Hastings' jaw tightened. That's not fair. Fair doesn't matter. True matters. Tell me I'm wrong. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Hastings exhaled. What do you want from me? I want you to remember why you joined. I want you to stop protecting yourself and start protecting your soldiers. I want you to be the officer you thought you'd be when you took the oath. MacArthur leaned forward. And I'm going to give you the chance. Starting next week, you're going to run the new training program Major Willis is developing. Purpose-driven discipline. Combining your ideas about motivation with the standards I'm implementing. Make it work. Hastings blinked. Sir, I thought you said I was only handling administrative. I lied. I needed to wake you up. Consider yourself awake. Now prove me right for giving you a second chance. Something shifted in Hastings' expression. Not quite gratitude, not quite hope, but something close to both. I won't let you down, sir. Don't let yourself down. I'm just the guy keeping score. The weeks blurred together in a rhythm of reveille and taps, inspection and training, failure and correction. MacArthur's daily walks became an institution. Soldiers who'd once scattered at the sight of officers now straightened up automatically when they saw him coming. Not from fear, from respect, from the growing understanding that standards existed for a reason, and that reason was keeping them alive. During the morning PT sessions, MacArthur began noticing a particular private who struggled more than most. Private Carlos Martinez was 20 pounds overweight, his round face red with exertion, his breathing labored. While other soldiers finished their runs and moved on to calisthenics, Martinez was still huffing around the track, alone, fighting a battle against his own body. MacArthur watched him for 3 days before intervening. On the 4th morning, he fell in beside Martinez during the run. Private, what's your story? Martinez's eyes widened in panic. Sir, I'm sorry I'm slow. I'm trying, I didn't ask for excuses. I asked for your story. They jogged in silence for a moment, Martinez struggling to find breath enough to speak. Grew up in San Antonio, sir. Big family. Food was love. By the time I realized I was overweight, I'd already joined. Barely passed basic. Been struggling ever since. You married kids? Yes, sir. Wife and a baby girl. That's why I can't wash out. I need this job. MacArthur nodded, understanding clicking into place. Fear of failure often drove people harder than hope of success. How many times have you failed the PT test? This will be my 3rd, sir. One more and I'm out. Not on my watch. Starting tomorrow, you train with me and Private Reeves at 0500. We're going to fix this. Not because I'm nice, because soldiers who can't run can't fight, and soldiers who can't fight get other soldiers killed. Understood? Yes, sir. The next morning, Martinez appeared at 0500, terrified but present. MacArthur had Reeves lead him through a modified training program, portion control, proper running form, building endurance gradually instead of trying to force it, and most importantly, accountability. Reeves weighed Martinez every 3 days, tracked his progress, celebrated small victories. Over the next month, Martinez lost 12 pounds. His run time dropped by 90 seconds. More importantly, his attitude changed. He started helping other struggling soldiers, sharing the techniques that had worked for him. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. He'd found purpose beyond avoiding failure. He'd found pride in improvement. Holloway's security team transformed the gate from a joke into a fortress. Every guard memorized protocols. Every vehicle received thorough inspection. The new procedures made everyone 5 minutes late for everything, and MacArthur didn't care. 5 minutes of inconvenience now might mean the difference between catching a threat and burying soldiers later. Willis threw himself into the new training program with the fervor of a convert. He developed scenarios that challenged soldiers not just physically but mentally and morally. Squad leaders faced situations where the easy choice conflicted with the right choice, where following orders might mean abandoning a teammate, where success measured in metrics didn't equal success measured in values. But the real transformation happened in the small moments. A specialist helping a private tie his boots correctly. A sergeant staying late to ensure his entire squad understood the day's lesson. A captain who'd been coasting for years, suddenly remembering what pride felt like. MacArthur saw it all and said little. Praise was a resource you didn't waste. He learned that from his own father, a Korean War veteran who believed that a man's character showed not in how he accepted compliments, but in how he handled their absence. 6 weeks into his command, the call came. MacArthur was in his office reviewing training scores when his phone rang with a Pentagon area code. He knew before he answered what it meant. The inspection, the reckoning, the moment when everything either validated or collapsed. Colonel MacArthur. Mac, it's Bill Garrett. Got some news. Date assessment team is coming to Carson, 4 weeks from today. MacArthur felt his stomach drop. That's 8 weeks ahead of schedule. I know, Pentagon moved it up. They're concerned about the reports coming out of there. Wants to see if your methods are working or if you're just stirring up trouble they'll have to clean up. Garrett's voice softened. This is it, Mac. Pass this and you write your own ticket. Fail and they'll close the base. 2,000 soldiers reassigned. Your legacy becomes the man who couldn't save Fort Carson. Who's leading the assessment? Frank Morrison. MacArthur closed his eyes. Of course it would be Frank Morrison, Ironside, the hardest man in an army of hard men, the inspector who'd never passed a unit that didn't deserve it, the legend who'd once failed an entire brigade because their coffee wasn't hot enough, saying that if they couldn't maintain a coffee pot they sure as hell couldn't maintain combat readiness. Understood. Mac Morrison's good, but he's also fair. Show him what you've built. Show him these soldiers are ready. He'll see it. A pause. How are you holding up, really? I'm fine. Liar, but I appreciate the effort. Call if you need anything. Garrett out. MacArthur sat in the silence after the call ended. 4 weeks, 28 days, 672 hours. It wasn't enough time, not nearly enough, but it was the time he had. He stood, grabbed his cover, and walked out into the Colorado afternoon. Soldiers moved across the base with purpose now. Not the rushed panic of people pretending to be busy, but the steady confidence of people who knew their jobs and took pride in doing them well. It was better. Measurably, observably better. But was it enough? He found Holloway at the gate, running a surprise drill with the new guards, a fake vehicle approaching with fake credentials, testing their ability to spot inconsistencies under pressure. MacArthur watched from a distance as the guards worked through their protocols. Calm, professional, thorough. Sergeant, he called out when the drill finished. A word. They walked away from the gate, toward the training grounds where the sunset painted long shadows across obstacle courses and firing ranges. We've got 4 weeks until the date assessment. Frank Morrison's leading it. Holloway whistled low. Ironside, Jesus. I need an honest assessment. Are we ready? Sir, we're better than we were. 1,000% better, but date isn't about better, it's about perfect, and we're not there yet. What do we need? Holloway thought for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. We need them to believe it's theirs. Right now they're following your standards because you're watching. We need them to follow these standards because they've internalized them, because they can't imagine any other way. How do we get there? We give them ownership. Stop telling them what to do and start asking them what should be done. Let them lead. Let them fail if they have to. Let them learn that excellence isn't something you do for a colonel. It's something you do for yourself and the people beside you. MacArthur nodded slowly. That's risky. We don't have time for many failures. No, sir, but we also don't have time for them to keep waiting for orders. At some point, they have to become the leaders who give orders. Holloway met his eyes. Major Willis has been saying that from the start. Maybe it's time we listened. That night, MacArthur called a meeting with Willis, Holloway, and Hastings. They gathered in his office, these three men who'd become the core of his command team. Willis with his theories and passion, Holloway with his experience and pragmatism, Hastings with his newfound commitment to redemption. Gentlemen, we have 4 weeks until Frank Morrison arrives to determine whether this base lives or dies. I'm going to do something I've never done in 35 years of service. I'm going to admit I need help. Willis leaned forward. What kind of help, sir? The kind that requires me to step back. Starting tomorrow, you three are running the training program. I'll observe. I'll advise if asked, but the decisions are yours. The methods are yours. The success or failure is yours. He looked at each of them. I've given you the foundation. Now build the house. Hastings shifted uncomfortably. Sir, that's a lot of responsibility with very little time. Welcome to leadership, Colonel. It's always a lot of responsibility with very little time. That's why we get paid the big bucks. MacArthur allowed himself the smallest of smiles. You asked me to trust you. I'm trusting you. Don't make me regret it. For the next 4 weeks, Fort Carson became a laboratory of leadership. Willis designed training exercises that pushed soldiers beyond their comfort zones. Holloway enforced standards, but also taught soldiers to enforce them on themselves. Hastings discovered he actually had a gift for mentoring when he stopped worrying about looking good and started focusing on making others better. And MacArthur watched. Every morning at 0500 he still walked the base, but now instead of inspecting, he observed, noted what worked, what didn't, where his team needed guidance, where they needed freedom to fail and learn. Reeves, who'd started as a project, became a leader in his own right. He formed a junior NCO study group where privates and specialists gathered to discuss leadership principles from David's journal. The group grew from 5 soldiers to 20 to 50. They called themselves the Old Guard, a half-joking reference to MacArthur's methods. But the joke became earnest, became identity, became pride. Martinez, now 15 pounds lighter and passing his PT tests, became the group's unofficial mascot. His transformation inspired others who struggled. If Carlos could change, anyone could change. That belief spread like wildfire through the ranks. 3 days before Morrison arrived, MacArthur's sister Sarah finally got through to him on the phone. Mac, you've been dodging my calls for 2 months. I've been busy. You're always busy. That's how you avoid dealing with things. Her voice softened. Have you been to visit David? The question hit like a gut punch. No. It's been 3 years, Mac. You can't keep running. I'm not running, I'm working. There's a difference. Is there? Sarah sighed. I know what you're doing. You think if you save enough soldiers, it'll make up for David. But it won't. Nothing will. He's gone, and you need to grieve him instead of trying to resurrect him in every 19-year-old you meet. MacArthur looked out his office window at soldiers running formation drills in the fading light. What if that's all I have left? What if this is the only way I know how to honor him? Then you're not honoring him, you're hiding from him. A long pause. Come home when this is over. Come to Arlington. Face what you've been avoiding, please. I'll think about it. That's what you always say. After she hung up, MacArthur sat in the darkness of his office and let himself feel the weight he'd been carrying. Sarah was right. He knew she was right. But knowing and accepting were different countries, and he wasn't ready to make that journey yet. At 0600 the morning Morrison arrived, Fort Carson stood in perfect formation. 2,000 soldiers in parade rest, uniforms immaculate, bearing proud. MacArthur stood at the front beside Willis, Holloway, and Hastings, and watched 3 Black Hawks descend from a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The lead helicopter touched down, and out stepped Colonel Frank Morrison, 62 years old and built like a Sherman tank. His dress uniform held enough ribbons to stock a craft store, each one earned in blood and sacrifice. He approached MacArthur with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that rushing was for amateurs. They saluted, perfect mirror images, 2 old soldiers who'd given everything to the service and would give more if asked. "Mac," Morrison said, "been a long time." "Frank, welcome to Fort Carson." Morrison's eyes swept across the formation, missing nothing. "Heard you've been working miracles. Also heard you've been pissing people off. Which one's true?" "Both, probably." "Good. Miracles without pissing people off aren't miracles. They're accidents." Morrison turned to face the assembled soldiers. "Let's see what you've built." And with those words, the real test began. Morrison moved through Fort Carson like a surgeon examining a patient for cancer. Methodical, thorough, missing nothing. His inspection team fanned out across the base with clipboards and measuring tapes, checking everything from the angle of flagpoles to the cleanliness of latrines. But Morrison himself focused on something harder to measure. He watched the soldiers, studied their eyes, listened to the spaces between their words. MacArthur shadowed him at a respectful distance, close enough to answer questions, far enough to avoid looking defensive. They walked in silence through the first barracks, Morrison's boots clicking on floors so clean you could eat off them. He ran a white-gloved finger along a window sill, checked the hospital corners on a randomly selected bunk, opened a wall locker and inspected the spacing between hangars. "Who's responsible for this barracks?" Morrison asked, his voice flat as Kansas. "Second Platoon, Bravo Company. Sergeant Hayes is the platoon sergeant." "Get him." 5 minutes later, Sergeant Hayes stood at attention in front of Morrison. Young for a sergeant, maybe 27, with the kind of nervous energy that came from wanting desperately to impress. Morrison looked him up and down like he was inspecting a rifle. "Sergeant, why are these floors so clean?" Hayes blinked, confused by the question. "Sir, we clean them every day. It's standard procedure." "I didn't ask what you do. I asked why you do it." The sergeant's Adam's apple bobbed. MacArthur could see the wheels turning, the young NCO trying to figure out the right answer. Finally, Hayes spoke with more confidence. "Sir, we clean them because cleanliness reflects discipline. A soldier who maintains his space will maintain his equipment. A soldier who maintains his equipment will maintain his mission readiness. And a soldier who maintains his mission readiness stays alive and keeps his brothers alive." Morrison's expression didn't change. "Who taught you that?" "Colonel MacArthur, sir. He says every small thing we do is practice for the big things we'll face." "Does he now?" Morrison turned to MacArthur. "Sounds familiar. Where'd you steal that from?" "You, Frank. Fort Benning, 1992. You were my platoon sergeant in Ranger School. Said those exact words to me when I complained about policing brass." The ghost of a smile touched Morrison's weathered face. "At least you were paying attention." Dismissed, Sergeant Hayes. After Hayes left, Morrison moved to the window and looked out at the mountains. "You're teaching them the old ways." "I'm teaching them the right ways." "Same thing," Morrison turned back. but knowing the words and living them are different. Let's see if your soldiers can back up their talk. The physical training test came next. 200 soldiers in formation at 0600 the following morning, the Colorado air cold enough to see breath. Morrison had brought his own test administrators, hard-eyed NCOs who'd probably been born doing push-ups. They ran the soldiers through the standard exercises. Push-ups, sit-ups, a 2-mile run. MacArthur watched from the sidelines with Holloway and Willis. The soldiers performed well, better than well. They crushed the minimums and pushed toward maximums like their lives depended on it. Because in a way, they did. Not their actual lives, but the life of Fort Carson. The life of this community they'd built over 8 weeks of sweat and discipline. But Morrison wasn't watching the strong ones. He was watching the ones who struggled. A private who was 20 pounds overweight huffing through push-ups. A specialist with bad knees grinding out the run. Morrison made notes. Lots of notes. "He's looking for weak links," Willis muttered. "One bad soldier and he'll use it to condemn the whole unit." "No," MacArthur said quietly. "He's looking for how we handle weak links. Watch." As the overweight private struggled through his final set of sit-ups, 3 other soldiers from his squad gathered around, not helping him cheat. Cheating would have been easy to spot. Instead, they counted for him, encouraged him. When he finished, barely meeting the minimum, they pulled him to his feet and one of them, a corporal named Rodriguez, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, Martinez. Tomorrow we go for 5 more." Morrison saw it, made a note. His expression revealed nothing. The weapons qualifications happened that afternoon at the range. The sharp crack of M4s echoed off the mountains as soldiers engaged targets from various distances and positions. Morrison walked the firing line, occasionally stopping to watch a particular shooter. When Private Reeves's turn came, MacArthur felt his chest tighten. Reeves had become a fine soldier in the past 2 months, but rifle marksmanship had never been his strength. His hands were steady enough, his breathing controlled, but something in his mental game faltered under pressure. MacArthur had worked with him for hours, trying to break through whatever barrier existed between Reeves and consistently hitting center mass. Now, with Morrison watching, Reeves settled into position. MacArthur could see the tension in the young man's shoulders, the slight tremor in his trigger finger. This was going to be rough. The first shot went wide. The second barely caught the target. Reeves's breathing became visible, his chest heaving. He was psyching himself out, letting the pressure crush him. MacArthur wanted to intervene, to talk him down, to remind him of everything they'd practiced. But this wasn't his test. It was Reeves's. Then something unexpected happened. Sergeant Holloway, who'd been supervising another lane, walked over and knelt beside Reeves. He didn't touch him, didn't coach him, just said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Reeves nodded once. His breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped. The next 15 shots grouped tight in the center mass. Not perfect, but passing, more than passing. When Reeves stood and cleared his weapon, Morrison approached him. "Private, what did your sergeant say to you?" Reeves hesitated, then stood taller. "Sir, he told me to shoot the way Colonel MacArthur's son would have shot, with honor, with focus, with the understanding that this weapon might save my life someday, so I better learn to respect it now." Morrison glanced at MacArthur, something unreadable passing across his face. Then he moved to the next shooter without comment. That evening, Morrison requested a private meeting with MacArthur. They met in the same office where MacArthur had first arrived, the one that still smelled like old coffee and institutional disappointment. Morrison poured himself a cup from the pot that had been sitting since morning, took a sip without flinching, and settled into a chair like he owned it. "Your son," Morrison said without preamble. "David, tell me about him." MacArthur felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He was a good officer, better than I was at his age, believed in the mission, believed in his men, died because someone else didn't believe enough to do their job right. And now you're trying to save every David who comes through here. I'm trying to make sure no father gets the call I got. Morrison took another sip of terrible coffee. Mac, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my immediate family. I had a son too, James. Lieutenant James Morrison Jr. He died in Iraq in 2008. IED. He was leading his platoon on patrol and he insisted on being first through a checkpoint. Said it was an officer's job to take the risk before asking his men to take it. The words hit MacArthur like a physical blow. Frank, I didn't know, I'm sorry. Nobody knew. I kept it quiet, threw myself into work, became the hardest inspector who nobody could please because if I was busy failing units for bad coffee, I didn't have to think about my boy bleeding out in the sand. Morrison set down the cup. But about 5 years ago, my wife sat me down and told me I had a choice. I could keep running from James's death or I could honor it. I could keep being angry at a world that took my son, or I could help make sure other sons had the training to survive what he didn't. What did you choose? Both. Some days I'm still angry. Some days I still run. But most days now I try to honor him by holding the line, by making sure that when I pass a unit, it's because they're actually ready, that their training might save them when everything goes to hell. MacArthur absorbed this, understanding blooming like dawn. Is that why Garrett sent you? Because you'd understand what I'm trying to do? Partly, also because if anyone can see through bullshit to the truth, it's me. And Mac, I need you to understand something. I want to pass Fort Carson. I want to believe you've built something real here, but I won't lie in my report. If your soldiers aren't ready, I'll say so, even if it means ending your career, even if it means we stop being friends, because that's how I honor my son, by never lying about readiness. I wouldn't want you to do anything else. Morrison nodded. Good, because tomorrow is when we really test them, the field exercise. 72 hours in the mountains. Simulated combat scenario. Your soldiers against my opposition force. If they pass that, they pass everything. If they fail, well, we'll cross that bridge when we burn it. After Morrison left, MacArthur sat alone in the darkening office. He thought about David, about Morrison's son James, about all the young men who died because someone somewhere had decided that good enough was good enough. The weight of it threatened to crush him, the accumulated grief of a generation of loss. His phone buzzed. A text from Holloway. Soldiers ready for tomorrow. They know what's at stake. We won't let you down, sir. MacArthur typed back. You're not doing it for me. You're doing it for each other. The reply came immediately. Same thing, sir. The pre-dawn darkness on the third day of Morrison's inspection felt heavier than usual. MacArthur stood outside the barracks watching soldiers load into trucks, their breath visible in the October cold. They moved with purpose, checked each other's gear, made sure everyone had what they needed. This was it, the real test, not of their physical skills or their ability to follow orders, a test of whether they'd internalized the culture MacArthur had tried to build. Whether they'd become a team or remained a collection of individuals wearing the same uniform. 3 Black Hawks lifted off carrying Morrison's opposition force to defensive positions in the mountains. Their mission was simple: hold a ridgeline and prevent MacArthur's soldiers from taking it. They were experienced, well-trained, led by some of Morrison's hand-picked NCOs who'd seen real combat and knew every trick. Fort Carson soldiers followed an hour later in trucks that climbed mountain roads as the sun painted the peaks orange and gold. MacArthur rode in the lead vehicle with Major Willis, who'd planned the operation, and Sergeant Holloway, who trained the soldiers executing it. Behind them came 200 men and women who'd been transformed from shambling mediocrity into something that at least resembled a professional force. The truck stopped 5 clicks from the objective. The soldiers dismounted and immediately began forming up without being told. Squad leaders checked their people. Platoon sergeants coordinated movement. Officers consulted maps and confirmed the plan. MacArthur watched it all happen and felt a complicated mixture of pride and terror. Pride because they were doing it right. Terror because doing it right in training didn't guarantee doing it right when bullets flew for real. Morrison stood on a nearby ridge with binoculars, observing. He'd brought a small team with him, evaluators who would score everything from tactical decisions to how soldiers treated each other under stress. Pass-fail metrics hiding in every moment. Lieutenant Colonel Hastings approached MacArthur, looking nervous but determined. He'd been assigned as the exercise commander, a test within the test. Could the man who'd been coasting for years actually lead when it mattered? "Sir, we're ready to begin on your order." MacArthur looked at the assembled soldiers, saw Reeves checking his weapon one final time, saw Sergeant Hayes encouraging a nervous private, saw the whole complex machinery of a military unit preparing to execute a mission. Then he looked back at Hastings. "It's not my order, Colonel. You're the commander. Give the order when you're ready." Hastings swallowed hard, then nodded. He turned to the formation and his voice carried clear and strong across the mountain air. "All units execute Phase 1. Move with purpose. Watch your spacing. Remember your training. Let's show them what Fort Carson can do." The soldiers moved out in textbook formation, bounding overwatch, proper intervals, scouts forward. MacArthur followed at a distance with Morrison, neither man speaking. The only sounds were boots on rock, equipment shifting, and the occasional hand signal passing information down the line. The first contact came 30 minutes in. Morrison's opposition force had set an ambush on the obvious approach route, exactly what MacArthur would have done. The question was whether Fort Carson's soldiers would recognize it or walk into the trap. They recognized it. The point squad halted, the squad leader raising a fist. Everyone froze. Then, without orders from above, they began flanking maneuvers. 2 fire teams swinging wide while the rest provided covering positions. It was basic infantry tactics, the kind taught in every manual. But basic done right beat fancy done wrong every single time. The ambush failed. Morrison's people withdrew to their next position. No casualties on either side, this being an exercise with blanks and referees. But Morrison made notes in his little book. Lots of notes. The day wore on. Skirmish after skirmish as Fort Carson's soldiers pushed toward the objective. They made mistakes, got pinned down twice, lost 3 soldiers to simulated casualties, but they adapted, learned, pushed forward with the kind of determination that couldn't be faked or taught in a classroom. MacArthur watched Private Reeves lead his squad through a particularly difficult approach, using terrain like he'd been born to it. At one point, Reeves called a halt because he spotted trip wire for a simulated IED. The kind of detail that separated living soldiers from dead ones. He carefully directed his squad around it, reported the position to his platoon leader, and continued the advance. As the sun began to set, Fort Carson's soldiers established a position within striking distance of the ridgeline. They'd advanced 5 clicks through hostile territory, maintained unit cohesion, and arrived with enough strength to execute the final assault. But Hastings made an unexpected call. "All units establish defensive positions. We hold here tonight. Assault at first light." Morrison raised an eyebrow at MacArthur. "Interesting choice. Why wait?" "Ask him yourself." Morrison approached Hastings, who was studying a map by red flashlight. "Colonel, you have momentum. Why give the enemy all night to prepare?" Hastings looked up, and MacArthur saw something in the man's eyes he hadn't seen before. Confidence rooted in purpose rather than ego. "Sir, my soldiers have been moving for 12 hours. They're tired. Pushing them into a night assault when they're exhausted increases the chance of mistakes. Mistakes get people killed. I'd rather attack at dawn with rested soldiers than at dusk with tired ones, even if it means giving up tactical surprise. And if the enemy uses the night to reinforce, then we'll deal with that. But I won't sacrifice my people's safety for a timeline." Morrison nodded slowly. "Carry on, Colonel." That night MacArthur moved through the defensive positions, checking on soldiers but mostly just watching them exist together. They'd broken into small groups for MREs and rest. Quiet conversations drifted through the darkness. Someone laughed. Someone else told a story about basic training, normal sounds, human sounds, the sounds of people who trusted each other enough to be themselves. He found Reeves on watch, staring out into the darkness where Morrison's opposition force waited. The private didn't turn when MacArthur approached, good security discipline, but he spoke softly. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, Private." "Your son, David, when he was my age, was he scared?" MacArthur settled onto the rock next to him. "Terrified. He told me once that the night before his first deployment, he threw up twice from anxiety. Thought it meant he wasn't cut out for this." "What did you tell him?" "That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being scared and doing the job anyway. That every soldier who's worth a damn is scared sometimes. The ones who say they're never scared are either lying or stupid, and stupid gets you killed faster than fear ever will." Reeves nodded, processing this. "I'm scared right now, not of the exercise, of letting everyone down, of proving I'm still that punk who disrespected you at the gate. Tommy, look at your squad. Look at how they follow you. You think they'd follow someone who wasn't worthy. You've earned your place here. Tomorrow, you'll prove it to yourself." "Yes, sir." MacArthur stood to leave, then paused. "David would have liked you, would have recognized himself in you, the doubt, the determination to be better. He'd have been proud to serve with you." After MacArthur walked away, he saw Reeves wipe his eyes quickly, then return to scanning his sector. Professional, focused, exactly what a soldier should be. Morrison found MacArthur an hour later, both of them drawn to the same ridge overlooking the encampment. Below, Fort Carson soldiers rested in defensive positions that would have made a textbook proud. Above, stars wheeled through a sky so clear and dark you could see the Milky Way like a river of light. "They're good, Mac, better than I expected. But good in training doesn't always translate to good in combat. You know that. I know that." Morrison pulled out a flask, took a sip, offered it to MacArthur, who declined. "The question I'm wrestling with is whether you've built something sustainable or if you've built something dependent on you being here to maintain it." "What's the difference?" "The difference is what happens when you retire. Do these soldiers keep the standards because they believe in them? Or do they slide back to mediocrity the moment you're gone?" MacArthur had wondered the same thing himself in the quiet hours of the night. "I don't know, Frank. I've done everything I can to make it about them, not me, to give them ownership. But you're right. We won't know until I'm gone." That's the fundamental problem with leadership. The best leaders make themselves obsolete. They build systems and cultures that outlive them, but it takes time. You've had 8 weeks. Most of these soldiers have only known the new Fort Carson. They don't remember the old one well enough to fear going back to it. "So what do I do?" Morrison returned the flask to his pocket. "You do what you've been doing. You trust them. Tomorrow's assault will tell us what we need to know, not just about their tactical skills, but about their character. whether they've really internalized these values or just memorized the words. The dawn came cold and clear. MacArthur watched as Fort Carson soldiers stirred from sleep, checked weapons, prepared for the final push. They moved quietly, efficiently, without the need for shouted orders or threats. Officers and NCOs moved among them, making small corrections, offering encouragement, ensuring everyone was ready. Hastings gathered his leadership team for final coordination. MacArthur stood close enough to hear, but far enough to make clear this wasn't his show. "We're going to hit them hard and fast," Hastings said, his finger tracing the map. "Alpha Company takes the left flank, Bravo the right. Charlie holds reserve. We suppress their positions with initial fire, then bound forward in teams." Questions. Captain Rodriguez from Alpha Company spoke up. "Sir, the left flank approach crosses an open meadow. Will be exposed for at least 2 minutes." "I know. That's why we're putting smoke down first, and why I'm going with Alpha Company. If I'm asking you to cross that ground, I cross it first." Something passed through the assembled leaders. Respect. Trust. The understanding that their commander wouldn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. It was everything MacArthur had tried to teach them, manifesting in a moment of leadership that would either vindicate his 8 weeks of work or prove it had all been theater. Morrison watched this exchange with his evaluator's eyes. Neutral, recording, judging. The assault began at 0700 exactly. Smoke grenades popped and white clouds rolled across the meadow. Alpha Company moved through it like ghosts, Hastings in the lead, his presence visible to his soldiers, making them braver than they'd be otherwise. Return fire from Morrison's opposition force cracked through the air, blanks but realistic enough to make hearts pound. Bravo Company swung right, using the terrain to mask their approach. Charlie Company established support positions and laid down covering fire. It was textbook combined arms tactics, the kind of coordination that required trust and practice in equal measure. MacArthur's heart hammered as he watched, not from excitement, from fear. Fear that they'd fail. Fear that they'd succeed but someone would get hurt anyway because even training exercises could go wrong. Fear that Morrison would find some flaw that invalidated everything. But mostly he felt pride, watching these soldiers execute with precision and courage, seeing Reeves directing his squad through a difficult advance without hesitation, seeing Sergeant Hayes controlling his platoon's fire and movement like a conductor leading an orchestra, seeing all of it come together into something that looked, finally, like a professional military force. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Private Martinez, the overweight soldier who'd barely passed his PT test, spotted a gap in Morrison's defensive line. Instead of keeping it to himself or waiting for orders, he reported it immediately to his squad leader, who reported it to Reeves, who reported it to his platoon leader. Within 2 minutes, an entire platoon was reorienting to exploit the gap. Morrison's opposition force fought hard, but Fort Carson's soldiers were relentless. They bounded forward, covered each other, maintained discipline under simulated fire. By 0900, they'd taken the objective. Hastings stood on the ridgeline, breathing hard, and radioed the all clear. Morrison climbed up to join them, his evaluators trailing behind with their clipboards and stopwatches. He walked the defensive positions Fort Carson's soldiers had just overrun, examined the approaches they'd used, talked quietly with his opposition force about what they'd seen. Finally, he gathered everyone together, 200 exhausted soldiers and the command team that had led them. The morning sun backlit Morrison, turning him into a silhouette against the sky. When he spoke, his voice carried to every soldier without shouting. "I've been inspecting military units for 23 years. I've seen the best and I've seen the worst. I've passed units that made me proud to wear this uniform, and I've failed units that made me question why I still do." He paused, letting the silence build. "Fort Carson, you are not the best unit I've ever inspected." MacArthur felt his stomach drop. Around him, soldiers who'd given everything for 72 hours deflated like balloons. "But you are the most improved. 8 weeks ago, this base was dying. Today, you executed a complex assault with discipline, courage, and tactical proficiency. More importantly, you took care of each other. I watched soldiers helping soldiers, leaders leading by example, a culture of excellence that started at the top and flowed all the way down." Morrison looked directly at MacArthur. "Colonel MacArthur has given you a gift. He's given you standards worth meeting and the belief that you can meet them. The question is what you do with that gift when he's gone. Do you maintain it, build on it, or let it slip away because it's hard and nobody's watching?" He turned back to the soldiers. "Fort Carson passes this inspection. Congratulations. Now comes the harder part, living up to it every single day for the rest of your careers." The cheer that erupted shook the mountain. Soldiers hugged each other, officers shook hands, tears flowed freely. MacArthur stood apart, watching it all, feeling something break open inside his chest. Not grief this time, something else. Something that felt almost like healing. Morrison approached him, extended his hand. "You did it, Mac. You saved them." MacArthur shook his hand but shook his head. "I didn't save anyone, Frank. They saved themselves. I just showed them they could." That's what leadership is, showing people they're capable of more than they thought. Your son would be proud. The words hit harder than any bullet. MacArthur felt his eyes burning, his throat closing. After 3 years of running, of hiding, of burying himself in work to avoid feeling, it all caught up to him at once. He excused himself, walked to a quiet spot behind some rocks, and finally let himself cry. For David. For all the lost sons. For the weight he'd been carrying for so long. When he returned 20 minutes later, red-eyed but steady, he found Reeves waiting. The young private stood at attention. "Sir, permission to speak freely." "Granted, Private." "Sir, I want to thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself, for teaching me what it means to be a soldier." Reeves pulled something from his pocket, David's journal. "I want to return this, sir, with respect." MacArthur looked at the worn leather, the journal that had carried his son's thoughts and dreams. Then he gently pushed it back toward Reeves. "Keep it. Pass it on someday to another soldier who needs to learn what you've learned. That's how we honor the ones we've lost, by making sure their lessons keep saving lives long after they're gone." "Yes, sir, I promise." That night back at Fort Carson, Morrison called MacArthur to his temporary quarters. The inspection was over, the results filed, but something in Morrison's expression suggested this conversation would be different. "Mac, I told you I had orders just to inspect. That was partly true. I also had orders to offer you something if you passed." Morrison pulled out a folder. "Pentagon wants to expand what you've done here. Create a program called Training the Trainers. You travel to bases across the country, teaching other commanders your methods. 3-year contract. Promotion to Brigadier General." MacArthur stared at the folder like it contained a live grenade. "Frank, I'm 59 years old. I was ready to retire 6 months ago." "I know. That's why they want you. Because you're not doing this for career advancement. You're doing it because you believe in it. That authenticity is what other commanders need to see." "And if I say no?" "Then you retire in 6 months like you planned. Go fishing, play golf, try to figure out who you are when you're not Colonel MacArthur." Morrison's voice softened. "But Mac, I'm going to tell you what my wife told me. Running from grief doesn't honor the dead. Fighting for the living does. You can retire and spend the rest of your life wondering if you did enough." or you can keep fighting to make sure no other father gets that phone call. MacArthur thought about David, about the journal passing from Reeves to some future soldier, about legacy and purpose, and whether a man's worth measured in years served or lives touched. He thought about Sarah telling him to go to Arlington, to face what he'd been avoiding. "Can I have 48 hours to think about it?" "Take 72. I'm not flying out until Friday." After Morrison left, MacArthur made a decision he'd been avoiding for 3 years. He booked a flight to Washington, D.C. Then he called his sister. "Sarah, it's Mac. I'm coming home. I need to visit David." He heard her breath catch. Then softly, "It's about time, brother, it's about time." The flight from Denver to Washington felt longer than any combat deployment MacArthur had ever made. He sat in coach, squeezed between a businessman who smelled like cologne and a college kid who slept the entire way with headphones blasting music loud enough to hear. MacArthur stared out the window at clouds that looked like cotton fields stretching to infinity and thought about all the reasons he'd avoided this trip for 3 years. Fear mostly. Fear that standing at David's grave would make the loss real in a way it hadn't been when he could pretend his son was just deployed somewhere unreachable. Fear that he'd break down completely and never put himself back together. Fear that he'd discover he didn't know how to be James MacArthur without the structure of duty to hold him upright. His sister Sarah met him at Reagan National. She was 2 years younger but looked older now, her hair more gray than brown, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at David's funeral. She hugged him hard enough to hurt, and he let her, needing the pressure to remind him he was still solid, still here, still breathing. "You look terrible," she said, pulling back to study his face. "You look like hell yourself." She laughed, the sound watery. "We're a pair, aren't we? The MacArthur siblings, too stubborn to cry, too proud to ask for help." They drove into Virginia in her old Subaru that smelled like coffee and dog hair. She'd gotten a golden retriever after David died, she explained. Named him Buddy. Something about the unconditional love of a dog helped on the days when human connection felt too complicated. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as they merged onto the highway. "No." "Good. If you were ready, I'd worry you were lying to yourself." They didn't go straight to Arlington. Sarah insisted on stopping at her house first, a small colonial in Alexandria with a yard that needed mowing and a porch that needed painting. Inside, Buddy greeted MacArthur like a long-lost friend, tail wagging so hard his whole back end shook. MacArthur knelt and let the dog lick his face, the simple joy of the animal's greeting breaking something loose in his chest. "He likes you," Sarah said. "Dogs no good people." "Dogs like everyone." "Not true." Buddy growled at my contractor for 3 weeks straight. "Turned out the guy was stealing from me. Dogs know." She made coffee and they sat at her kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting through windows that needed cleaning. MacArthur noticed photos on the refrigerator. David at various ages. His graduation from West Point. His commissioning ceremony. His last visit home before deploying to Afghanistan, grinning at the camera with his arm around Sarah, both of them pretending the goodbye was temporary. "I talk to him sometimes," Sarah said quietly, out loud, like he's still here. "My therapist says it's healthy. Processing grief through continued relationship or some such psychological terminology. Mostly it just makes me feel less alone." "What do you say to him?" "I tell him about my day, about Buddy, about you when you'd actually return my calls." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I tell him I'm proud of him, that I miss him, that some days the missing is so heavy I can barely get out of bed, but I do it anyway because he'd want me to." MacArthur felt his throat tighten. "I don't know if I can do this, Sarah. Stand at that grave and say goodbye. It feels too final. You're not saying goodbye, Mac. You're saying hello. Hello to the grief you've been running from. Hello to the reality that David's gone but his impact on the world isn't. Hello to the fact that you're still alive and that has to mean something. What if it doesn't? What if I'm just going through the motions, pretending my work at Fort Carson mattered, when really I'm just an old man trying to resurrect his dead son in every 19-year-old I meet? Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the coffee mug, but her grip was warm. Then you're an old man who changed hundreds of lives trying to honor one. That's not nothing, Mac. That's everything. They sat in silence for a long time, brother and sister, survivors of the same loss, holding on to each other because sometimes that's all you can do. That night, MacArthur couldn't sleep. He lay in Sarah's guest room staring at the ceiling and listening to Buddy snore in the hallway. Around 0200, he gave up and went downstairs. Found Sarah already there, sitting in the dark with a photo album open on her lap. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Apparently not." She patted the couch beside her. "Come look at these. I haven't opened this album in a year. Thought maybe tonight was the right time." The photos chronicled David's childhood. A gap-toothed 6-year-old holding his first baseball glove. A gangly 12-year-old at his first Boy Scout camp. A serious 16-year-old in his JROTC uniform, already looking like a soldier even though he couldn't legally vote. MacArthur had been deployed for most of these moments, present in spirit but absent in body, and the guilt of that washed over him fresh and sharp. "I miss so much," he said. "You were serving," he understood that. Understanding and accepting are different things. Sarah turned a page, revealing a photo MacArthur had never seen. David may be 22, in full dress uniform, standing at attention but with a slight smile playing at his lips. On the back, in David's handwriting, "Just like Dad, finally." "He was so proud to follow in your footsteps," Sarah said. "Every letter he wrote me from Afghanistan mentioned you, how you'd taught him to lead, how he was using lessons you'd given him, how he hoped to make you proud." "He did, God, he did." "Then tell him, tomorrow, at Arlington, tell him everything you've been holding in for 3 years." The morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. MacArthur dressed in his service uniform, the dress blues he saved for ceremonies and funerals. He checked his reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger. When had he gotten so old? When had the gray overtaken the brown completely? When had the lines around his eyes become canyons? Sarah drove them to Arlington National Cemetery in silence. The gates opened onto rolling hills covered in white headstones marching in perfect formation, thousands upon thousands of them, each one marking a life given in service. The sight of it stole MacArthur's breath. All these sons and daughters, all these families destroyed and remade by loss, all this sacrifice that the living barely noticed as they went about their comfortable lives. Section 60 held the recent dead. Iraq, Afghanistan, the forever wars that had consumed a generation of young Americans. Sarah parked and they walked through the section, reading names and dates, doing the math that told terrible stories. 19 years old, 22, 25. Lives barely started before they ended. Then they reached David's grave. The headstone was simple white marble like all the others. Captain David James MacArthur, born March 15, 1990, died August 3, 2021. Beloved son, proud ranger. The words felt inadequate for containing a whole human life, all the dreams and hopes and potential reduced to 2 lines of text and some dates. MacArthur stood frozen. He'd imagined this moment countless times, but imagination was nothing like reality. The reality of that white stone. The reality of knowing his son's body lay beneath it. The reality that no amount of wishing or working or bargaining with God would bring him back. Sarah touched his arm gently. "I'll give you some privacy, take your time." She walked away and MacArthur was alone with his son, or alone with his son's memory, or alone with his grief. The distinctions blurred. He knelt in the grass, not caring about the dirt on his uniform, placed his hand on the headstone. The marble was cold even in the morning sun. "Hey buddy, it's Dad. I know I'm late. 3 years late. I'm sorry. I was scared. Scared that coming here would make it real. Scared that I wouldn't know what to say. Scared that saying anything would mean accepting you're really gone." His voice cracked. "But you are gone, aren't you? You're not on some classified mission I can't know about. You're not coming home. You're here, in the ground, and I'm up here, still breathing, still trying to figure out why." A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling leaves in nearby trees. MacArthur took it as permission to continue. "I read the after-action report so many times I memorized it. You died because your support unit failed to arrive. They failed because their equipment wasn't maintained. Their equipment wasn't maintained because their commander cut corners, because someone somewhere decided good enough was good enough. And you paid the price for their laziness with your life." The anger he'd been suppressing for 3 years rose up, hot and bitter. "It wasn't fair. You did everything right. You trained hard, led well, took care of your men. And you still died because some officer couldn't be bothered to enforce standards. Some NCO couldn't be bothered to check maintenance logs. Some private couldn't be bothered to do his job correctly." MacArthur's hand balled into a fist on the marble. "I've been so angry, David, at them, at the army, at God for letting it happen, at myself for not being there to protect you. And I channeled that anger into Fort Carson, trying to make sure no other kid died the way you did, trying to honor you by saving people you'll never meet." He paused, wiping his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. Across the cemetery, another family stood at another grave, their shoulders shaking with sobs. An old man, probably a father, supported by younger people who could only be his children. The same story playing out in infinite variation. Loss, grief, the struggle to continue. "But Sarah says I've been running, using work to avoid feeling this." MacArthur's voice dropped to a whisper. "She's right. I have been. Because feeling this hurts so much I can barely breathe. Because if I let myself really accept that you're gone, I'm afraid I'll fall apart and never put the pieces back together." He thought about Private Reeves, about Sergeant Holloway, about all the soldiers at Fort Carson who'd transformed under his leadership, about Morrison's offer to expand that work across the entire army, about the choice he had to make. "I got offered a promotion, Brigadier General, 3 more years of service traveling around teaching other commanders what I did at Carson. Part of me wants to say no, to retire like I planned, to be done with the military and all the pain it's brought me. But another part thinks maybe this is how I honor you, by making sure your death means something, by saving other Davids." A woman appeared at the edge of his vision. Older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. She approached slowly, respectfully, and knelt at the grave next to David's. MacArthur read the name. Private First Class Michael Chen. Died August 3, 2021, the same day as David. The woman noticed MacArthur watching and gave a sad smile. "Your son?" "Yes, ma'am, yours." "My nephew, but I raised him after my sister died, so yes, mine." She pulled a small American flag from her purse and placed it by the headstone. "Michael served under your son. Captain MacArthur was his platoon leader." The words hit MacArthur like electricity. "You're Margaret Chen." She looked surprised. "You know me." "I know of you. David wrote about Michael in his letters, said he was a good soldier, smart, dedicated, always looking out for his squad mates." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. They died together, did you know that? When the support didn't arrive and the fighting got heavy, Captain MacArthur refused to leave wounded behind. Michael was hit and your son carried him to cover, stayed with him. They were found together. MacArthur hadn't known the details. The report had been clinical, stripped of the human story beneath the facts. He stayed with Michael until the end. The medic who survived said Captain MacArthur held Michael's hand, told him he'd done well, told him to hang on, told him his family would be proud. Margaret's voice broke. Your son gave my nephew comfort in his last moments. He didn't die alone because of David. Something shifted in MacArthur's chest. A weight he'd been carrying loosened slightly. David hadn't just died. He died doing what leaders do, taking care of his soldiers, refusing to abandon them even when abandoning them might have saved his own life. I come here every week, Margaret continued, and I tell Michael about my life, about his cousins, about the scholarship fund we started in his name. I tell him his death mattered, that we'll make sure it mattered. She looked at MacArthur. Do you do that? Tell your son his death mattered. MacArthur realized with shame that he hadn't. He'd been so focused on the injustice of David's death, on the preventable nature of it, that he'd never considered what David had actually accomplished in dying. The courage it took to stay, the love it took to comfort a dying soldier instead of seeking safety, the leadership it took to put someone else first until the very end. I haven't, he admitted. I've been angry about how he died instead of grateful for how he lived. Margaret reached out and touched his hand. Then tell him now, tell him he was brave, tell him he was good, tell him his life mattered more than his death. She stood slowly, knees creaking. I'll leave you alone, but Colonel MacArthur, thank you for raising a son who died with honor. That's all any parent can hope for. After she left, MacArthur turned back to David's grave with new eyes, not seeing just the loss but the life. The 21 years of joy and frustration and pride that had led to a man brave enough to stay with a dying soldier instead of saving himself. David, I've been looking at your death all wrong. I've been seeing it as a failure, a preventable tragedy, and it was those things, but it was also a testament to who you were. You stayed with Michael, you comforted him, you led to the very end. MacArthur's voice strengthened. I've spent 3 years angry that you died. I should have spent them proud of how you lived. He thought about Fort Carson, about Reeves reading David's journal and learning from words written by a man he'd never meet, about Holloway finding redemption through teaching younger soldiers what honor looked like, about Hastings discovering that leadership meant sacrifice and service instead of self-preservation. Your journal is teaching soldiers I'll never meet. Your example is living on through them. You're not gone, David. You're just serving in a different way, through me, through them, through everyone who learns that excellence isn't optional and character isn't negotiable. MacArthur pulled Morrison's folder from his jacket pocket. The offer, the promotion, 3 more years. He looked at it with fresh understanding. This wasn't about running from grief. It was about running toward purpose, about taking the pain of loss and transforming it into something that protected life. I'm going to take the job, training the trainers. I'm going to spend the next 3 years making sure other commanders understand what you understood. That soldiers aren't statistics. They're someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's whole world, and we owe them our best, not our good enough. Our best. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and saluted his son's grave. A proper salute, sharp, respectful, the salute of one soldier honoring another. I love you, David, I'm proud of you, and I promise I'll make your death count for something, not by being angry, by being better, by teaching others to be better. That's how I'll honor you, not by avoiding this place, by coming back, by remembering, by continuing the work you started. The sun had climbed higher, warming the cemetery. Other families moved between graves, each carrying their own grief, their own memories, their own determination to keep loving people they couldn't hold anymore. MacArthur felt a connection to all of them, a brotherhood and sisterhood of loss. They were all members of a club nobody wanted to join, but everyone handled with dignity because the alternative was letting the loss define them instead of refine them. Sarah found him an hour later, still standing at the grave but calmer now, more settled. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You okay?" "I am, finally." He showed her the folder. "I'm taking this job 3 more years, training commanders across the army." "Mac, are you sure? You were ready to retire." "I was ready to run. There's a difference." He looked back at David's headstone. "I met Margaret Chen, Michael's aunt. She told me how David died, staying with her nephew, comforting him, leading to the end. I've been so focused on the failure that killed him I forgot about the courage that defined him." Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face. "He'd be proud of you for coming here, for facing this, for choosing to keep serving." "I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for every David out there who deserves commanders who give a damn, who enforce standards because standards save lives, who lead by example because example is the only leadership that matters." They walked back through Section 60 together, past rows of white headstones marking lives given in service. At the cemetery entrance, MacArthur paused and looked back. Somewhere in those orderly rows, David rested among heroes, not despite his death but because of how he'd lived, not defined by the failure that killed him but by the courage that characterized him. That evening, MacArthur called Morrison from Sarah's house. Buddy lay at his feet, the dog's warmth a comfort against the weight of the day. "Frank, it's Mac. I'm taking the job." "You sure? This isn't a decision to make lightly." "I've never been more sure of anything. I went to Arlington today, visited David, talked to the aunt of one of his soldiers, finally understood that I've been looking at his death wrong. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a testament. And I'm going to spend the next 3 years making sure that testament teaches every commander in the Army what leadership really means." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Your son would be proud, Mac." "I hope so. I'm finally starting to be proud of myself for something other than rank and ribbons, for actually making a difference, for understanding that service doesn't end when it's hard. It matters most when it's hard." "When can you start?" "Give me 2 weeks to finish things at Fort Carson. Make sure Hastings and Willis are ready to take over. Make sure the culture can sustain without me there to enforce it. Then I'm yours." After the call, Sarah made dinner and they ate at her small kitchen table like they'd done as kids, before life got complicated, before loss taught them that everything good is temporary and everything hard is eternal if you let it be. "You're different," Sarah said, studying him over her spaghetti. "Lighter somehow." "I set something down today, something I've been carrying too long. Doesn't mean I don't miss him. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. But the hurt isn't crushing me anymore. It's just there. Part of me, like a scar." "Scars mean you survived something that tried to kill you." "Yeah, they do." That night, MacArthur slept through for the first time in 3 years. No nightmares. No waking at 0300 in a cold sweat. Just deep, dreamless sleep that left him feeling more rested than he'd been since the phone call that had ended his world and begun his exile from grief. The next morning, he returned to Arlington alone. Sarah offered to come, but he needed to do this part solo. He knelt at David's grave again, this time without the crushing weight of avoidance. This time as a father who'd finally learned to grieve without drowning. "I'm heading back to Colorado today. Got 2 weeks of work left, then I start the new job, but I'll come back. Every month if I can, every quarter at minimum. I won't stay away again. Won't use distance and duty to avoid remembering you." He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the headstone, not to be morbid, to remember, to keep David present in his life instead of buried in his past. Private Reeves has your journal. He's teaching other soldiers from it. Your words are still saving lives, buddy, still making a difference. That's your legacy. Not how you died, how you lived, how you taught, how you led. A groundskeeper passed by, an old man pushing a cart full of flags for upcoming Memorial Day. He nodded respectfully at MacArthur, one veteran recognizing another. These were the people who maintained this sacred ground, who ensured the grass stayed trim and the headstones stayed clean, who understood that remembering was a verb, an action, a choice you made every day. MacArthur stood and saluted one final time. "I'll make you proud, son, every day for the rest of my life. That's my promise. That's my purpose. That's how I'll transform this grief into something that honors you instead of hollows me." The flight back to Colorado felt different. MacArthur sat in the same cramped coach seat, but the weight on his chest had lifted. He stared out at the same clouds but saw possibility instead of prison. The businessman beside him tried to make conversation about the Broncos, but MacArthur politely declined, needing the silence to process everything that had shifted in the past 48 hours. He'd gone to Arlington broken and returned healing. Not healed. Healing was a process, not a destination, but healing nonetheless, moving toward wholeness instead of hiding from fragments. When the plane landed in Denver, MacArthur turned on his phone to find a text from Reeves. "Sir, hope your trip was good. We're ready to make you proud when you get back." MacArthur typed a response. "You already have, Private. See you tomorrow at 0500. Then he sent another text. "To Morrison, I'm in. Let's save some soldiers." The final text went to Sarah. "Thank you for making me come home, for making me face what I needed to face. I love you." Her response came immediately. "Love you too, brother. David would be so proud. I know I am." MacArthur collected his bag from the carousel and walked out into the Colorado night. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark shapes against a darker sky. Above them, stars scattered like diamonds on velvet. David had loved these mountains, had talked about retiring here someday, building a cabin, teaching his kids to fish and hike and appreciate silence. Those dreams had died with him, but new dreams had been born. Dreams of soldiers trained so well they came home. Dreams of commanders who understood that leadership was sacred trust. Dreams of a military that honored its fallen by protecting its living. MacArthur climbed into his truck, the old Ford that still smelled faintly of his son, and started the engine. He had 2 weeks to finish what he'd started at Fort Carson. 2 weeks to ensure the culture could sustain. 2 weeks to prove that change, real change, could outlive the person who initiated it. Then 3 years of the hardest, most important work of his life. Teaching, training, traveling, spreading the gospel of excellence and accountability and leadership that actually deserved the name. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward Fort Carson, toward the final chapter of this phase of his journey, toward a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The last commandant was heading home, but home wasn't a place anymore. It was a purpose, and that purpose was just beginning. The sun rose over Fort Carson on MacArthur's final morning as commanding officer, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold that reminded him of every dawn he'd witnessed in 35 years of service. He stood at his office window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and watched soldiers moving across the base with purpose and pride. His soldiers, except they weren't his anymore. They belonged to themselves now. That was the whole point. 2 weeks had passed since Arlington. 2 weeks of preparation and transition, of ensuring that what he'd built could survive without him. Major Willis would take command today at 1000 hours, promoted to lieutenant colonel, ready or not. Sergeant Holloway had been promoted to Sergeant Major, the senior enlisted leader who would keep Willis honest and the standards high. Even Hastings had found his footing, accepting a role as executive officer with genuine humility instead of resentful compliance. But it was Private Reeves who knocked on MacArthur's door at 0500, already in perfect uniform, already standing taller than the punk kid who'd called him old man 4 months ago. "Sir, permission to speak." "Granted, Tommy, and you can drop the formality. We've earned that much." Reeves stepped inside but remained at attention. Some habits ran too deep to break easily. "Sir, I wanted to thank you, properly, before you leave, for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself, for teaching me what it means to wear this uniform, for giving me your son's journal and trusting me to learn from it." MacArthur set down his coffee and faced the young man. 4 months. That's all it had been. 4 months that had transformed a lazy gate guard into a soldier other men followed. 4 months that proved people could change if someone cared enough to show them why change mattered. "Tommy, I didn't give you anything you didn't already have. I just held up a mirror until you could see it yourself." MacArthur pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. "But I do have something for you. Orders. You've been accepted to Ranger School. You ship out in 3 weeks." Reeves's eyes went wide. "Sir, I never applied for Ranger School." "I know I did. Pulled some strings with General Garrett. Called in favors I've been saving for 20 years. You're going. No arguments." "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just make me proud, make David proud, make yourself proud." MacArthur extended his hand. "You're going to be a great NCO someday, Tommy. Maybe even an officer if you want it. But more importantly, you're going to be the kind of leader who remembers what it felt like to be lost, who sees struggling soldiers and helps them instead of judging them. That's the real gift, not the promotion, the empathy." They shook hands, and MacArthur saw tears in Reeves's eyes that the young man tried hard to hide. Some things transcended military bearing. Some moments demanded emotion. "Sir, can I ask you something? About David?" "Anything." In his journal he wrote about fear, about being scared before deployments, about wondering if he was good enough. Did he ever tell you that? MacArthur thought about the conversations he'd had with his son, the ones where David had been honest about his doubts. He did. Night before his first deployment, we sat on my porch and he told me he was terrified. Terrified of failing his men. Terrified of freezing up. Terrified of proving he wasn't really his father's son. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that fear was proof he cared. That only sociopaths feel no fear. That courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. And I told him that he was already twice the officer I'd been at his age because he had the humility to admit his doubts instead of hiding behind false confidence." Reeves nodded slowly, processing this. "That helps because I'm scared too, of Ranger School, of failing, of letting you down after everything you've invested in me." "Then you're exactly where you need to be. Fear keeps you sharp, overconfidence gets you killed." MacArthur squeezed the young man's shoulder. "You're going to do fine, Tommy, better than fine, and when you graduate I want you to call me, not Colonel MacArthur, just Mac, because by then you'll have earned the right to friendship instead of just respect." After Reeves left, MacArthur packed the few personal items he'd accumulated in 4 months. A photo of David in his West Point uniform. The coffee mug Sarah had sent him with "World's Most Stubborn Brother" printed on the side. A challenge coin from Morrison with Ironside engraved on one side and "The Old Guard Never Dies" on the other. Everything else belonged to Fort Carson or to the next commander who'd occupy this office. At 0800, the entire base assembled for the change of command ceremony. 2,000 soldiers in formation, uniforms perfect, bearing proud. The flag snapped in a morning breeze that carried the scent of pine and possibility. General Garrett had flown in from Pentagon to preside, his dress uniform heavy with ribbons that told stories of wars and losses and victories earned in blood. MacArthur stood at attention on the platform, flanked by Willis and Holloway, and looked out at faces that had become familiar. Soldiers he'd trained, officers he'd mentored, NCOs he'd challenged to be better than they thought possible. This was the last time they'd all be his responsibility. Tomorrow they'd belong to Willis. The day after, he'd be somewhere else, teaching other commanders how to build what he'd built here. Garrett stepped to the podium, his voice carrying across the assembly without amplification. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to honor a transition. Colonel James MacArthur came to Fort Carson 4 months ago with orders to save a dying base. He exceeded those orders. He didn't just save Fort Carson, he transformed it, created a culture of excellence that will outlive any single commander. That's the mark of true leadership, not what happens while you're watching. What continues after you leave." The general's eyes found MacArthur. "Mac, I've known you for 30 years, served with you, bled with you, called you friend when friendship was hard to come by, and I've never been more proud of you than I am right now. Not for what you did here, though that's remarkable, for how you did it, with integrity, with purpose, with the understanding that leadership is service, not power. You've set the standard. Now Lieutenant Colonel Willis and this entire base will carry it forward." The ceremony proceeded with military precision. MacArthur relinquished command, passing the flag to Garrett, who passed it to Willis. The symbolism was heavy but necessary. One generation passing responsibility to the next, the old guard trusting the new guard to maintain what had been built. When Willis spoke, his voice was steady but emotional. "Colonel MacArthur taught me that discipline and compassion aren't opposites, that you can demand excellence while showing empathy, that soldiers don't need a friend, they need a leader who cares enough to make them better even when being better is hard." He looked directly at MacArthur. "Sir, I promise you, we won't let this slip. We won't go back to what we were. You didn't just change procedures, you changed hearts. And hearts don't forget." The assembly erupted in applause that rolled like thunder across the parade ground. Soldiers who'd once resented MacArthur's standards now celebrated them. Officers who'd bristled at his methods now embraced them. The transformation was complete not because MacArthur had forced it, but because they'd chosen it. Ownership. That was the secret. People protect what they own. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the officers' club. Handshakes and well wishes and promises to stay in touch that everyone knew would fade with time. But Morrison pulled MacArthur aside, away from the crowd, out onto a balcony overlooking the training grounds. "You did it, Mac. Really did it. This base will be a model for the next decade because of what you built in 4 months. They did the rebuilding. I just pointed them toward what they'd forgotten they could be." Morrison pulled out his flask, took a sip, offered it to MacArthur, who accepted this time. The whiskey burned warm and smooth. "I got a call from Pentagon yesterday. They're already lining up your first assignment for training the trainers. Fort Richardson in Alaska. Commander, there is a good man, but he's struggling. Culture's toxic. Standards have slipped. Sound familiar?" "When do I start?" 2 weeks. They're giving you time to rest, settle into your new rank, figure out what a brigadier general actually does besides look important and sign things." Morrison's expression turned serious. "But Mac, I need to warn you about something. What you did here was special, lightning in a bottle. You had the right people, the right timing, the right motivation. It won't always be like this. Some bases won't want to change. Some commanders will resist. Some soldiers will resent you for demanding more than they want to give. I know. Do you? Because failure is different when you're trying to replicate success. The first time you're proving something's possible. Every time after you're living up to expectations. The pressure's different, heavier. MacArthur looked out at soldiers running formations, their movements synchronized and purposeful. "Frank, I'm not doing this to prove anything anymore. I'm doing it because David's death has to mean something beyond the pain it caused. If I can save one soldier by teaching one commander to give a damn, then maybe I can live with the loss. Maybe I can sleep at night knowing I transformed grief into protection instead of letting it become bitterness." Morrison nodded slowly. "Your son would be proud, Mac. Hell, I'm proud. And I'm a miserable bastard who's never proud of anything." They stood in comfortable silence, two old soldiers watching young soldiers prepare for wars they couldn't imagine yet. The sun climbed higher, warming the day, burning off the morning chill. Somewhere in the building behind them, Garrett was regaling junior officers with stories from Gulf War. Holloway was probably ensuring the reception food met standards. Willis was likely panicking about his first day as commander. Life continuing. The mission ongoing. That evening, MacArthur drove away from Fort Carson for the last time as its commanding officer. His truck was packed with the same meager belongings he'd arrived with 4 months ago. But he was leaving with more than he'd brought: purpose, healing, the understanding that love persists even after death if you let it transform into service. He stopped at the main gate, the same gate where Reeves had called him old man and changed both their lives forever. The new guards snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and respectful. MacArthur returned the salute with equal precision. "As you were, soldiers, keep up the good work." "Yes, sir. Safe travels, sir." He drove through the gate and onto the highway, watching Fort Carson shrink in his rearview mirror until it disappeared behind the mountains. 4 months of his life, a fraction of his career, but the most meaningful fraction. The part where he'd learned that legacy wasn't about rank or ribbons. It was about the people you touched and the changes you inspired and the example you left behind. His phone rang. "Sarah." "Hey, how'd it go?" "Good, hard, right, all of the above." "You heading home?" "Which home? I don't really have one anymore." "Then come here. Stay with me and Buddy for your 2 weeks off. Let me feed you actual food instead of whatever garbage you've been eating. Let me make sure you're okay before you disappear into Alaska." MacArthur felt something warm expand in his chest. Family, connection, the things that mattered more than any military accomplishment. "I'd like that, thank you." That's what sisters are for. Besides, Buddy misses you. He keeps looking at the guest room door like you're going to walk out any minute. "Tell him I'm on my way. I'll be there tomorrow." "Drive safe, Mac. Love you." "Love you too." He drove east through Colorado as the sun set behind him, painting the sky in colors that had no names. Somewhere ahead, Sarah waited with unconditional love and a dog who didn't care about rank. Somewhere beyond that, David rested in Arlington among heroes. Somewhere in his future, Fort Richardson and 100 other challenges waited. But right now, in this moment, MacArthur was just a man driving through the mountains, listening to old country music, and feeling grateful to still be breathing. 2 weeks with Sarah passed like a dream. She fed him home-cooked meals and didn't ask about the military. They walked Buddy through the neighborhood every evening, the dog pulling on his leash with enthusiasm that bordered on violence. They watched old movies and argued about whether John Wayne or Clint Eastwood was the better cowboy. They visited David's grave together, bringing flowers and standing in comfortable silence that spoke louder than words. On the last day before MacArthur had to leave for Alaska, they drove out to Shenandoah National Park, found an overlook where you could see mountains rolling away to the horizon like frozen waves. Sarah brought a thermos of coffee, and they sat on the hood of her car like they'd done as teenagers, before life got complicated. "You seem different," Sarah said. "Lighter, like you finally set something down." "I did at Arlington, at Fort Carson. I set down the idea that I could have prevented David's death if I'd just been better, smarter, more vigilant. I set down the guilt that was crushing me. It's still there. The guilt, the grief. But it's not crushing me anymore. It's just there, part of me, like you said, like a scar. What changed? I met Margaret Chen, Private Chen's aunt. She told me how David died, staying with her nephew, comforting him, being the leader his soldiers needed even at the end. I'd been so focused on the injustice of his death that I'd forgotten the nobility of it. He didn't die running. He died standing. That matters. Sarah wiped her eyes. He was so much like you, stubborn, brave, too willing to sacrifice himself for others. I used to think that was a flaw. Now, I think it's the only thing that makes life worth living. The willingness to put others first, to serve something bigger than yourself, to believe that your actions matter even when you won't be around to see the results. They sat in silence as the sun moved across the sky and shadows lengthened in the valleys below. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Are you going to be okay? In Alaska and all the places after, this is a hard road you've chosen. 3 more years of fixing broken things. I am, because I'm not fixing things anymore. I'm honoring David by protecting other Davids. That's different. Fixing implies something's wrong with me and I'm trying to make it right. Honoring accepts that grief is right and natural and transforms it into something protective, that I can live with, that I can build a life around. The next morning, MacArthur loaded his truck for the trip to Alaska. A long drive, several days at least, but he'd always preferred driving to flying. Preferred the meditation of white lines and truck stops and landscapes changing gradually instead of the violent dislocation of stepping onto a plane in one place and off it in another. Sarah hugged him hard at the door. Buddy whined, sensing departure. Call me when you get there. And Mac, come back for Thanksgiving. David would want us together. I will, promise. He drove north through Virginia, into Maryland, through Pennsylvania. The truck's heater worked overtime against October cold that promised winter. The radio played a mix of country and classic rock, songs about loss and redemption and roads that led home. MacArthur sang along when he knew the words, hummed when he didn't, and felt something like peace. Somewhere in Montana, he stopped at a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since Eisenhower was president. Ordered coffee and pie from a waitress who called him honey and refilled his cup without asking. An old man at the counter, wearing a cap that marked him as a Korean War veteran, nodded respectfully. Military. 35 years, just started my last tour. What brings you out this way? Going to Alaska, got a job teaching commanders how to lead. The old man smiled, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and stories. We could have used that in my day. Too many officers who cared more about their careers than their men. You doing good work, son. Important work. Thank you, that means a lot. My boy was Army too. Lost him in Iraq. IED. The old man's voice stayed steady, but his eyes betrayed the permanent wound. So when I see someone still trying to make it better, still trying to protect the young ones, it matters to me, to all of us who lost someone. MacArthur felt the connection, the invisible thread that linked all Gold Star families. I lost my son too, Afghanistan, 3 years ago. Then you know that the only thing worse than the pain is the thought that they died for nothing, that their sacrifice was wasted. That's why I'm doing this, to make sure it wasn't wasted, to make sure their deaths protect future lives. The old man extended his hand. Thank you, from one Gold Star father to another. Thank you for turning grief into service. That's the only thing that helps, the only thing that makes it bearable. They shook hands, 2 strangers connected by loss, and MacArthur understood that this would be his life now. meeting other fathers, other mothers, other siblings who'd lost someone, carrying their stories, honoring their dead by protecting their living. It was a heavy burden but a worthy one, the kind of weight that strengthened instead of crushed. Fort Richardson loomed out of the Alaskan darkness like a ghost town. November had brought snow and cold that made Colorado feel tropical. MacArthur's breath frosted in the air as he stepped out of his truck, his joints protesting the long drive and the sudden temperature drop. He was 60 years old now, promoted to brigadier general, and feeling every year of it in his bones. The base commander, Colonel Raymond Price, met him at the headquarters building. Price was MacArthur's age, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too much time in places humans weren't meant to be. They shook hands and MacArthur felt the grip of a man holding on too tight to something slipping away. "General MacArthur, welcome to Richardson. I wish the circumstances were better." "Tell me about it, the real situation, not the official version." Price led him inside to an office that smelled like desperation and failure. 3 soldiers dead in the past year, training accidents, or that's what we called them, but you and I know there's no such thing as an accident, just failure to prepare, failure to supervise, failure to enforce standards. What happened? A private died from hypothermia during cold weather training because his team leader didn't check his gear. A corporal fell from a climbing wall because the safety equipment wasn't inspected. A specialist died from accidental discharge because weapons discipline had gotten sloppy. Price's voice cracked. And I let it happen. I saw the warning signs and I told myself we'd fix it. But we didn't. And now 3 families have folded flags and empty chairs at dinner. MacArthur recognized the guilt, had lived with it himself, still lived with it in quieter moments. "Colonel, you can spend the rest of your life drowning in what you should have done, or you can spend it making sure it doesn't happen again. Which do you choose?" "I want to fix it, but I don't know how. I've tried. God, I've tried. But the culture here is resistant. The soldiers are cynical, the officers are burned out, and I'm just one man who's already lost their trust." "Then we rebuild that trust, the same way I rebuilt it at Fort Carson, one soldier at a time, one standard at a time, one day at a time." MacArthur pulled out his notebook, the one that had guided him through Fort Carson's transformation. "I'm going to be here for 60 days. That's all Pentagon can spare. In 60 days, we're going to turn this base around or we're going to know definitively that it can't be done. Either way, you'll have your answer." Over the next 2 months, MacArthur worked with Price to implement the same principles that had saved Fort Carson. Daily leadership walks at 0500, personal investment in struggling soldiers, standards enforced with explanation instead of arbitrary punishment, purpose-driven discipline that connected every task to the larger mission of keeping soldiers alive. It was harder here. The Alaska cold made everything harder. The soldiers were more cynical, scarred by the 3 deaths and the leadership that had failed them. The officers were exhausted, working in a culture of fear where any mistake might kill someone. But slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. MacArthur found another Tommy Reeves, a private named Jackson who reminded him so much of the Fort Carson Gate Guard that it hurt. He invested time, shared David's story, explained that discipline wasn't punishment but love for your future self. And he watched Jackson transform the same way Reeves had, proving that the model worked beyond Fort Carson, beyond any single base. On his last day at Richardson, Price walked with him to his truck. The northern lights danced overhead, green and purple curtains of light that made the world feel magical and small. "Sir, I can't thank you enough. 2 months ago I was ready to resign, ready to accept that I'd failed and there was no recovering. You showed me that failure isn't permanent, that you can rebuild. That leadership is about getting up after falling, not never falling at all. Raymond, the work of transformation was yours, not mine. I simply reminded you of what you already knew deep down." MacArthur opened his truck door. "Now keep going. Don't let this slip. Don't let those 3 soldiers have died for nothing." "I won't, I promise." They shook hands and MacArthur drove away from his second transformation, heading south toward his third, fourth, fifth. This would be his life now for the next 3 years. Traveling, teaching, troubleshooting, turning broken bases into models and broken commanders into leaders. The work was exhausting. The travel was lonely. The pressure was constant. But every night when MacArthur laid down in whatever hotel or temporary quarters he was occupying, he thought about David, about Margaret Chen's nephew, about the 3 soldiers at Richardson and the countless others he'd never meet whose lives he was protecting through the commanders he trained. And he slept well, not because the grief was gone. Grief never went away, but because he'd transformed it into purpose, had taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and turned it into the best thing he could do for others. 18 months into the trainers program, MacArthur received an invitation. Fort Carson was dedicating a new training facility. They wanted him there for the ceremony, wanted him to see what his 4 months had grown into. He flew to Colorado on a crisp spring morning that reminded him of the day he'd first driven through those gates. But everything was different now. He was different. The base was different. The world was different. Or maybe he just saw it differently, through eyes that had learned to accept loss without being destroyed by it. The ceremony was simple. A building named in honor of the soldiers Fort Carson had trained. A plaque thanking MacArthur for his service, but the real ceremony was walking through the base with Willis and Holloway and seeing what they'd maintained. The discipline, the pride, the culture that had survived 18 months without him because they'd made it theirs instead of his. Reeves was there, wearing Ranger tabs now, a sergeant in his own right. He'd taken leave to attend, bringing with him 3 privates he was mentoring using the same methods MacArthur had used on him. "Sir, I want you to meet my guys. Private Martinez, Private Washington, Private Kim. I'm teaching them from Captain MacArthur's journal. They're the next generation." MacArthur shook hands with each of them, seeing the hunger to be better, the willingness to work harder, the belief that excellence was possible. This was legacy. Not buildings or plaques or medals. People teaching people teaching people, the chain extending into a future he'd never see but had helped create. That evening the old team gathered at a bar outside the base. MacArthur, Willis, Holloway, Hastings, Reeves. They told stories and laughed and pretended the years hadn't changed them even though they all knew better. Years always changed people. The question was whether they changed you for better or worse. "Sir," Willis said, slightly drunk on nostalgia and beer, "you gave us back our purpose, all of us. We were going through the motions, collecting paychecks, waiting to retire. You reminded us why we joined, what the uniform means, what service really is." "The capacity for greatness was always in you," MacArthur said, choosing his words carefully. "I just cleared away the debris so you could see it again." Later, standing in the parking lot under stars that shone brighter away from the city lights, Holloway pulled MacArthur aside. "Sir, I got selected for Sergeant Major of the Army. The board called yesterday. I shipped to Pentagon in 2 months." MacArthur felt pride swell in his chest. "Marcus, that's incredible. You've earned it, every bit of it. I never would have even applied if you hadn't believed in me first, if you hadn't seen past the disciplinary action to the soldier underneath." Holloway's voice thickened. "You gave me my career back, my life back, my belief in the system back. How do I thank you for that?" "Pay it forward. Every soldier you meet, every NCO you mentor, every crisis you navigate, remember what it felt like to be lost. Help them find their way the same way I helped you find yours." They embraced, two soldiers who'd become brothers through shared commitment to something bigger than themselves. And MacArthur understood that this was what David had died for, not for oil or politics or some abstract concept of freedom. For this, for the bonds between soldiers, for the brotherhood that transcended rank and race and background, for the belief that service mattered and sacrifice meant something. The next 3 years blurred together in a montage of bases and commanders and soldiers who needed someone to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. MacArthur went from Alaska to Texas to North Carolina to Germany. Everywhere he went, he planted seeds. Some grew immediately. Some took time. Some never grew at all. But he kept planting because that was the job, not success. Effort. Faith that seeds planted in good soil eventually bear fruit, even if you're not there to harvest it. He visited David's grave every quarter without fail. Sometimes Sarah came. Sometimes he went alone. Always he told his son about the soldiers he'd trained, the lives he'd touched, the legacy that carried David's name forward into a future neither of them would see but both had shaped. On the last day of his 3-year contract, MacArthur stood at Arlington one final time as Brigadier General James MacArthur. Tomorrow he'd retire for real. 62 years old, 38 years of service. Enough, more than enough. Well, buddy, I did it. 3 years, 26 bases, hundreds of commanders trained, thousands of soldiers touched. I'd like to think I made a difference, that your death led to life for others, that the grief transformed into protection. He placed his hand on the cold marble. I'm retiring tomorrow, really retiring this time. No more last missions, no more one more tour, just rest, and remembering, and being grateful I got to serve alongside people like you. The wind moved through Arlington, rustling flags and leaves. MacArthur stood and saluted his son one last time, the sharpest salute of his life, the one that meant goodbye and thank you and I love you all wrapped into a gesture their shared service made sacred. He walked back through Section 60, past thousands of graves holding thousands of stories, each one someone's David, each one a sacrifice that the living owed honor through remembrance and service. He'd spent 6 years trying to pay that debt. He'd spend the rest of his life knowing it could never fully be paid, but trying was enough. Trying was everything. Sarah waited at the cemetery entrance, Buddy panting happily in the back seat. You ready? I am. Let's go home. Where's home, Mac? He thought about Fort Carson and Fort Richardson and all the bases between. Thought about the soldiers who'd become family. Thought about David resting behind him in eternal formation. Thought about the future stretching ahead, quieter now but no less meaningful. Home is wherever we choose to make it, and I choose here, with you, with Buddy, with memories of David and service and all the people I was privileged to lead and learn from. They drove away from Arlington as the sun set over the nation's capital, painting monuments and memorials in gold light that promised tomorrow. MacArthur was retired now. No more uniforms, no more salutes, no more reveille at 0500, but he was still a soldier, would always be a soldier, not because of rank or duty or obligation, because of choice. The choice to believe that service mattered and sacrifice meant something, and love persisted even after death, if you were brave enough to let it transform you. The last commandant had finally come home, not to a place, to a purpose fulfilled, to a grief honored, to a legacy established, to a peace earned through service and maintained through remembrance, and that was enough. That was everything. That was all any soldier could hope for. This story represents something we're losing, leaders who see soldiers as people, not statistics. MacArthur's journey from grief to purpose, especially the Arlington scene, hit me hard. My father served in Korea and taught me discipline isn't cruelty, it's caring enough to demand excellence. What struck you most? The gate confrontation, the journal, or MacArthur facing his son's grave? If you've served or raised someone who did, share below. Next Friday, a sniper with PTSD and one shot that changes everything. Subscribe so you don't miss it.